Everyone assumes Cartman is just loud and dumb, a kid who stumbles into chaos by accident. Decade after decade, fans laughed at him as the group's resident idiot. One theory, built entirely from his own schemes, says that act might be the smartest thing he does. What that theory actually proves sits inside this video. Cartman's anti-Semitism was built as a weapon against real bigots. Eric Cartman has said more hateful things about Jewish people than almost any character in television history, and the two men responsible for writing those words are Trey Parker, who voices Cartman, and Matt Stone, who is Jewish and voices Kyle Broflovsky, the boy Cartman targets most. That single detail changes the entire conversation before anything else gets said about this topic. The joke was never aimed downward at a real group of people from the outside. It was built from the inside by a Jewish writer who chose to hand the ugliest lines in the show to a character designed from day one to be wrong, loud, and eventually humiliated for being wrong. Understanding that design choice is the only way to make sense of why this part of the show has lasted almost 30 years without disappearing, and why it keeps returning in new and stranger shapes every few seasons instead of quietly fading out the way most dated jokes do. South Park began airing in August of 1997, and Cartman was there from the very first episode, already loud, already selfish, already convinced the world owed him something. The anti-Semitic material did not appear right away in its full form. It grew over the following seasons alongside everything else about his character, becoming darker and more specific as the writers figured out exactly how far they wanted to push him. By the time the show reached its middle seasons, Cartman's hatred of Jewish people, and of Kyle in particular, had become one of the clearest and most consistent threads running through the entire series. It shows up in small moments, like casual insults thrown across a classroom, and in massive, season-defining episodes built entirely around it. The clearest example of this design sits in a Season 8 episode from 2004 called The Passion of the Jew. The episode follows Cartman after he watches Mel Gibson's film about the death of Jesus and decides to build an entire hate movement against the Jewish people living in his town. He convinces a crowd of adult fans of the movie to march with him, dresses himself in a full Hitler costume, complete with the mustache and the uniform, and teaches the group a set of German phrases, telling them these words are actually Aramaic, the ancient language spoken in the film they just watched. The crowd believes him completely. Not one adult in that group stops to question why a 10-year-old boy from their town suddenly has fluent knowledge of a 2,000-year-old language. Not one of them notices that the costume he is wearing belongs to one of the most recognizable and hated men in modern history. The animation plays this straight rather than as pure slapstick. The marching crowd is drawn with the same seriousness as any real protest scene, which makes the moment land as something closer to horror dressed up as comedy rather than as a simple throwaway joke. The voice work behind Cartman during these scenes carries a calm, confident tone, almost like a boy giving a school presentation, which makes the manipulation feel even more chilling once the audience understands what he is actually doing. The episode does not let Cartman walk away clean. By the end, Gibson himself, brought into the story as a character, smears his own waste across a building before covering Cartman in it directly. It is a strange and disgusting way to end an episode, but it works as one of the clearest punishments the show has ever handed any character. The joke was never that hating Jewish people is funny. The joke is that an entire group of grown adults were careless enough and desperate enough for something to believe in that they followed a child dressed as one of history's worst men down the street without asking a single real question. Cartman is the one who gets covered in filth at the end. The show makes sure of that. This same pattern repeats across the show's run in smaller but equally telling ways. Cartman has demanded that Kyle hand over what he calls Jew gold, a phrase invented entirely out of ignorance rather than anything connected to real Jewish history or belief. There is no such thing as Jew gold. Cartman does not know that, or does not care, and the show lets his own confusion sit there in plain view rather than correcting it for him. In another well-known episode, Le Petit Tourette, Cartman learns about Tourette syndrome, a real medical condition that can cause people to blurt out words they cannot control, including offensive ones. Rather than treating the condition with any seriousness, Cartman fakes having it so he can walk through public spaces shouting slurs and insults at strangers, protected by the assumption that he has no control over what comes out of his mouth. He treats a real disorder that affects real people as a costume he can put on and take off whenever it benefits him. Each of these moments follows the same basic shape. Cartman says or does something ugly. The show frames him as pathetic or ridiculous for doing it, and the people around him either see through the trick eventually or suffer real consequences for having believed him in the first place. The writing never once asks the audience to laugh along along with Cartman's beliefs. It asks the audience to laugh at how far he will go and how easily the people around him fall for it. The most recent major example of this pattern arrived in the season 26 premiere, which aired in February of 2023. The episode was written as a direct response to comments made by the rapper Kanye West, who had gone through a public and widely covered period of making anti-Semitic statements the year before, including appearances on shows where he praised Hitler and spread conspiracy theories about Jewish people controlling major industries. In the South Park episode, Cartman becomes the voice of a small cherub character based on West, who has recently found religion and rebranded himself with a new name built around his Christian awakening. Cartman, acting as this character's mouthpiece, spreads a rumor around school that Kyle secretly controls Hollywood, playing directly into one of the oldest and most common anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that has existed for over a century. He also tries to turn another classmate, Tolkien Black, against Kyle by claiming that Jewish people stole Black identity, a lie with no basis in anything real. The episode shows, almost step by step, how quickly and completely a baseless claim can spread through a group of people once someone repeats it with enough confidence, even when the claim makes no logical sense under any real scrutiny. Students begin pitching movie ideas to Kyle in the school hallway because they have absorbed the lie without stopping to check whether any part of it is true. The episode also draws a direct and pointed connection between the cherub character's sudden religious rebranding and his anti-Semitic statements, at one point having the character say that a Christian message and a Nazi message are the same thing, a line that even Cartman, of all people, finds too extreme. That single detail matters. The show is willing to let its own most hateful character be the one who draws a line, which says something about how far the writers wanted this particular joke to go and where they wanted it to stop. Then there is the strangest turn in this entire thread. In a 2021 special called South Park Post-COVID, which jumps the story forward 40 years into the future, an adult version of Cartman has become an Orthodox rabbi. He leads a congregation in Colorado Springs, wears a prayer shawl wherever he goes, and has a Jewish wife named Yentl, along with 3 children given Hebrew names. His old trademark blue hat has been replaced by a small head covering, worn during religious services. The special never fully settles whether this conversion is genuine or whether it is one more long, elaborate scheme aimed at his oldest rival, Kyle, who by this point in the future has drifted away from his own faith entirely. This is not even the first time the show has used this exact joke. Back in a 2012 Passover special, Cartman briefly claims to convert to Judaism for reasons that turn out to be entirely selfish and fall apart almost immediately once his real motive becomes clear. Whether the later, more serious-looking version from post-COVID is meant to be sincere or is simply the same old trick played out over a much longer timeline, the writers clearly wanted the audience sitting with the same question that has followed this character for almost 3 decades. Is anything Cartman does ever really about anyone besides himself? Even something as personal and serious as faith. Not everyone agrees that this material has aged well, or that it has done what its creators originally intended it to do. Some critics and writers have pointed out that a joke repeated for almost 30 years, no matter how clearly the show frames the person telling it as foolish or evil, can still end up spreading the very language and ideas it was built to mock. One widely shared post online, seen by tens of thousands of people, argued that the show helped make casual anti-Semitic jokes feel normal for an entire generation of young viewers who grew up watching it, regardless of whether that was ever the intended effect. The argument suggests that repetition itself carries weight. Even a joke framed as criticism, told often enough in a show as widely watched and quoted as this one, can slowly wear down how shocking or unacceptable certain ideas feel to a young audience hearing them again and again through a beloved character. Other writers have pushed back strongly against this reading, pointing out that South Park has never treated Jewish people as a uniquely protected or uniquely targeted group within its writing. The show has spent nearly 30 years mocking every religion, every political side, every celebrity, and every identity group with roughly the same level of aggression and the same willingness to make its own worst character say the ugliest version of any given belief. From this perspective, singling out the Jewish material as somehow more dangerous than the rest of the show's targets misses the larger point of what the writers were building the entire time. Both sides of this argument have continued showing up in articles, essays, and online discussions for years, and neither side has fully settled the debate, nor is it likely either side ever will. What almost nobody seriously disputes, though, is the intention sitting behind the writing itself. Matt Stone, who grew up Jewish and who gives Kyle his voice every episode, has spoken about how the show uses Cartman's hatred as a mirror held up to real-world bigotry, rather than as any kind of endorsement of it. The choice to make a 10-year-old boy the mouthpiece for these ideas carries real meaning once it gets examined closely. A 4th grader saying something hateful has no actual power behind it in the real world. He holds no political office. He commands no army. He has no real platform beyond his own small neighborhood and the handful of people foolish enough to listen to him. Every single scheme he builds around his hatred eventually collapses, and it often collapses specifically because the adults surrounding him turn out to be just as gullible and just as easily led as he is manipulative and cruel. The show has never once been interested in giving these ideas any lasting weight or any real victory. It has always been interested in showing exactly how weak, how hollow, and how laughably fragile these ideas look once someone points a camera directly at the person saying them and lets the audience watch the whole plan fall apart. None of this erases how uncomfortable some of these episodes can be to sit through, especially when pulled out of their full context and viewed on their own. A 10-year-old boy dressed as one of history's most infamous men, leading a crowd of adults through the street chanting hateful phrases, is not an image that softens easily, no matter how much explanation gets wrapped around it afterward. But looking across nearly 3 decades of this same basic joke, told through Cartman again and again in different forms and different decades, a clear and steady pattern holds firm every single time. He is never right about any of it. He never wins in any lasting or meaningful way. And the people around him who choose to believe what he says, whether they are children on a playground or adults marching behind him in matching uniforms, always end up looking far worse for having done so than Cartman himself ever manages to look smart. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. There is one more piece of this puzzle still sitting unresolved, one that connects directly to a secret buried inside the show for almost a decade before it finally came out, involving the identity of Cartman's own father. Section 2. Real psychologists have studied Cartman as a case of childhood antisocial behavior. Eric Cartman has been talked about in college classrooms in a way that almost no other cartoon character ever has. He has shown up in real psychology courses, not as a joke or a passing reference, but as an actual case study handed to students who are training to become therapists and mental health professionals. This is not something the South Park writers set out to do on purpose. Nobody sat down in a writer's room and planned for a 4th grader from a cartoon to end up in a college textbook. It happened because Cartman was written with such a clear and consistent set of behaviors, repeated across hundreds of episodes over nearly 30 years, that real researchers eventually noticed how useful he was for teaching people how to spot patterns of harmful behavior in real children. In 2016, a group of researchers published a study with a direct and simple title, Diagnosing Cartman. The study was built around a college class where students were learning how to study patterns of behavior that concern doctors when they show up in real children. The class split students into 2 groups. One group was taught to look for a checklist of specific behaviors, things like lying often, hurting others without feeling bad about it, or breaking rules again and again without changing course. The other group was taught to look at broader personality traits instead, things like how selfish a person tends to be, how much they enjoy controlling others, or how little guilt they seem to carry after doing something wrong. Both groups were then asked to apply what they learned to Cartman as their subject. The point of the exercise was never to prove that a cartoon character is a real person with a real mental health condition. Cartman is not real, and nothing about him can be truly diagnosed in a medical sense. The point was to see which teaching method helps students understand and apply these ideas more clearly. According to the researchers, the results showed that both approaches worked well together, and students found that having a character as clearly and consistently written as Cartman gave them something concrete to practice on before they had to apply the same thinking to real patients later in their careers. This is worth sitting with for a moment before moving further, because it says something important about how carefully Cartman was actually built. Writers can create a character who acts mean or does bad things without that character holding together as a believable pattern once someone studies him closely. A lot of cartoon villains are written to be bad in whatever way a specific episode needs that week, with little thought given to whether their behavior lines up from one episode to the next. Cartman is different. The behaviors he shows in his very first appearance back in the 1997 premiere episode called Cartman Gets an Anal Probe line up almost perfectly with the behaviors he still shows decades later. He lies to get what he wants. He blames other people the moment something goes wrong. He shows almost no concern for how his actions affect anyone around him, and he rarely, if ever, expresses real guilt. guilt, even when the harm he causes is severe. A character written this consistently over such a long period of time by two men who have voiced him and written him personally for the entire run of the show ends up looking a lot like the kind of behavior pattern real doctors are trained to notice and study. That consistency is exactly why he became useful enough for an actual research paper. Outside of the formal academic study, plenty of other writers with backgrounds in psychology have looked closely at Cartman and come to similar conclusions using their own analysis. One well-known piece of writing on the subject breaks his personality down using a framework psychologists sometimes use to measure 5 basic traits every person carries in different amounts. The framework looks at how open a person is to new ideas and experiences, how organized and disciplined they are, how much they enjoy being around other people, how kind and cooperative they tend to be, and how much they worry or feel negative emotions. Applied to Cartman, the pattern that comes out is fairly stark. He shows very little interest in new ideas or in understanding people who think differently from him, preferring instead to stay locked into whatever belief benefits him most in the moment. His kindness and cooperation toward others sit at rock bottom, since nearly every kind act he performs turns out, once examined closely, to have some selfish motive hiding underneath it. His comfort around people and his taste for control run in the opposite direction, high and constant, since Cartman rarely hesitates to insert himself into any situation where he can be the one giving orders. Writers examining Cartman through this lens have also pointed toward 2 specific patterns that keep showing up across the show, patterns that real doctors do study in actual children and adults. The first pattern involves a person who believes they are more important than everyone around them and who expects special treatment because of it, paired with a near total absence of caring about how their actions affect other people. The second pattern involves someone who breaks rules and hurts others without feeling the normal amount of guilt or worry that most people feel afterward, often becoming skilled at manipulating people to get away with it. Writers who study Cartman are careful to note that he is a fictional character built for comedy, and that his behavior is stretched to an extreme level specifically because that extreme level makes for better jokes and a clearer target for satire. Real children and real adults showing similar behavior almost never reach the level Cartman does, and their situations deserve to be treated with far more care and seriousness than a cartoon character ever could be. Even with that difference in mind, the underlying patterns line up closely enough that these writers keep returning to Cartman again and again as an easy way to explain what these patterns look like in an exaggerated, easy-to-recognize form. Not every writer who has studied Cartman agrees on exactly which label fits him best, and this disagreement turns out to be one of the more interesting parts of the whole conversation. Some argue that Cartman fits the pattern of someone who seems to have been born with these traits already baked in, showing almost no ability to feel normal human connection from a very young age, regardless of how he was raised. Others push back hard against this reading, pointing out that Cartman is shown, across many episodes, having moments of real attachment and even real fear. He shows clear insecurity at the idea of being left out or abandoned by his friends. His relationship with his mother, while deeply unhealthy in almost every way, does contain flashes of something that looks like genuine need and even something close to love, buried underneath years of dysfunction. Writers who focus on these softer moments argue that Cartman's behavior looks less like something he was simply born with and more like something shaped heavily by how he was raised. His mother has been shown giving in to nearly every demand he makes since he was old enough to talk, rarely if ever setting real limits, even when his behavior toward her personally becomes cruel or disrespectful. A child raised with no real boundaries, who learns early on that bad behavior gets rewarded rather than corrected, can grow into an adult who expects the entire world to bend the same way his mother always has. Under this reading, Cartman is less a child born without the capacity for empathy, and more a child who was taught, through years of being given everything he wanted, that empathy was never something he needed to bother developing in the first place. This disagreement matters because it points toward 2 very different explanations for the same set of behaviors, and South Park itself never fully settles the question either way. The show gives evidence supporting both sides depending on which episode a person watches. There are moments where Cartman seems completely unreachable, cold in a way that goes beyond simple bad parenting, reacting to serious harm he has caused other people with something closer to pride than guilt. There are other moments where the show pulls back the curtain just slightly, showing a boy who is deeply afraid of being alone, who craves approval far more than he ever admits out loud, and who occasionally reacts to real emotional pain in ways that look uncomfortably human. The writers seem to enjoy keeping both possibilities alive at once, rather than picking one and committing to it fully. This uncertainty is part of what makes Cartman such rich material for actual psychology researchers rather than a simple one-note villain. A character who can be read multiple ways by trained professionals studying real behavior patterns is a character built with far more depth than his loud, crude surface usually lets on. Beyond the direct academic study from 2016, Cartman has continued showing up in psychology classrooms in other forms. Instructors teaching courses on personality and behavior have used him as an example students can practice writing formal evaluations about, since doing this kind of writing is a normal part of training for anyone who wants to work in mental health. One instructor described using this method specifically because letting students study a famous or widely known character, rather than jumping straight into real patient cases, makes the exercise feel less intimidating and more approachable, while still teaching the exact same skills they will need later. Students walk through the same steps a real evaluation would require, looking at patterns of behavior over time, considering possible explanations rooted in environment as well as explanations rooted in something closer to a person's basic wiring, and weighing evidence on both sides before reaching any kind of conclusion. Cartman, because decades of consistent writing have given him such a deep well of behavior to study, ends up working extremely well for this kind of exercise, arguably better than almost any other fictional character from any other long-running show. None of this means Cartman carries some kind of official real-world diagnosis, and it is worth being completely clear about that point. He is a drawing. He is voiced by an actor. He does not have thoughts or feelings of his own outside of what a small group of writers decide to give him each week. Nothing about him can be truly diagnosed in the way a real doctor evaluates a real patient sitting across from them. What can be said honestly, and what researchers and writers with real training in this field have said themselves, is that the patterns written into Cartman line up closely enough with patterns doctors do study in real people that he has become a genuinely useful teaching tool. That is not a small thing for a cartoon character to achieve, and it says a great deal about how carefully Parker and Stone built him from the very beginning, even while using him mostly to make audiences laugh. Looking at specific episodes helps show exactly why Cartman lines up so well with these patterns in the first place. Across the show's run, he has built elaborate, carefully thought out plans purely to get revenge on people who wronged him in fairly minor ways. Plans that require real intelligence and patience to carry out, even though the payoff is almost always wildly out of proportion to whatever started the conflict. He has shown almost no lasting guilt after causing serious harm to other people, often reacting instead with pride at how well his plan worked, or annoyance that something about the plan did not go exactly as intended. He regularly convinces other people, including full-grown adults, to go along with plans that should raise obvious red flags, using confidence and calm delivery to smooth over details that do not actually add up under any real scrutiny. He treats his own mother with open cruelty on a regular basis while still depending on her completely for food, shelter, and constant approval, a contradiction he never seems to notice or care about. Every one of these patterns shows up again and again across different seasons, different plots, and different decades of the show, which is exactly the kind of long-term consistency that makes a character interesting to people who study behavior for a living rather than just for entertainment. It is also worth noting how differently Cartman is written compared to the show's other three main boys, since this contrast is part of what makes the pattern so clear. Stan, Kyle, and Kenny all show real growth at different points across the show's run. They feel guilt when they hurt someone. They apologize, sometimes clumsily, and they occasionally learn something from their mistakes, even if the lesson does not always stick perfectly. Cartman almost never does this. Episode after episode, he causes harm, faces some kind of setback because of it, and then resets right back to where he started, showing no real sign that anything from the experience changed him even slightly. Writers who study behavior patterns pay close attention to exactly this kind of thing, since an inability to learn from consequences over a long stretch of time is one of the clearest signals used to identify certain patterns of concern in real children. The show did not need to make this contrast obvious for comedic reasons alone. The other three boys could just as easily have been written the same way Cartman is, resetting to zero after every episode with no consequences carrying forward. The fact that they were not, while Cartman specifically was built this way on purpose, suggests a level of intention behind his character that goes beyond simply making him funny. There is also something worth mentioning about how audiences have responded to all of this over the the years, since the response itself has become part of the ongoing psychological conversation around Cartman. Despite everything discussed here, Cartman remains one of the most popular characters on the entire show, arguably the character most associated with South Park as a whole in the minds of casual viewers who have never watched a full episode. People quote his lines constantly. He appears on more merchandise than any other character. This creates an interesting question that writers studying the show have raised directly. Why does an audience continue to find so much entertainment in a character who, by nearly every measure discussed here, represents one of the clearest examples of harmful behavior patterns ever put on television? Part of the answer likely comes down to the simple fact that watching Cartman scheme and manipulate from a safe distance, through a screen, with full knowledge that none of it is real, carries none of the actual danger or harm that being close to a real person like him would carry. Comedy has always found ways to make audiences laugh at behavior they would never tolerate in real life, and Cartman may simply be one of the most extreme and successful examples of that tradition ever created for television. None of this research or analysis changes the basic experience of watching the show, and none of it is meant to take away from how funny Cartman can be across hundreds of episodes. What it does add, though, is a layer of understanding about why his character has stayed so consistently compelling for almost 30 years straight, long after most cartoon villains from the same era have been forgotten. A character built with this much consistency, studied seriously enough to end up in real psychology coursework, was clearly never just a simple joke machine designed to say outrageous things for a cheap laugh. He was built, whether entirely on purpose or through years of careful, consistent writing choices, to hold together as a genuinely coherent picture of a specific kind of harmful behavior, one that real researchers have found worth studying long after the episode credits roll. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The disagreement over whether Cartman was simply born this way or shaped into it points directly toward one of the darkest and strangest secrets the show has ever revealed about him, one buried for almost a decade before finally coming out into the open. Section 3. Cartman killed his own father and did not find out for 9 years. Scott Tenorman Must Die aired on July 11th, 2001 as the 4th episode of season 5, and it stands today as one of the most talked about episodes in the entire history of South Park. On IMDb, it holds the highest user rating of any single episode the show has ever produced. Rolling Stone ranked the episode's final scene as the second best moment in the show's history. Fans voted it into second place during a major vote Comedy Central ran in 2011, asking viewers to pick their all-time favorite episodes. Trey Parker and Matt Stone have both named it among their personal favorites on multiple separate occasions over the years. All of that praise exists for one simple reason. This episode marks the exact moment Cartman stopped being a foul-mouthed, spoiled kid who said shocking things for a laugh and became something far darker, a boy capable of real, calculated cruelty with no real limit in sight. The episode begins with a 9th grader named Scott Tenorman tricking Cartman out of $10 by convincing him that buying pubic hair will help him reach puberty faster. Cartman, desperate to grow up and prove himself more mature than his friends, falls for the trick completely. Once he realizes what happened, he demands his money back. Scott refuses, humiliates him further, and eventually burns the money directly in front of him just to rub in the win. Cartman spends the rest of the episode trying every method he can think of to get his $10 back and to get revenge for the embarrassment. Nothing works. Scott outsmarts him at every turn. By the end of the episode, Cartman decides that simple revenge is not enough anymore. He wants something far bigger. What happens next is where the episode crosses into territory the show had never gone near before. Cartman learns that Scott's parents keep a pony on a nearby farm, belonging to a man named Bill Denkins. He tricks Scott into believing the pony is scheduled to be slaughtered, knowing this will push Scott's parents to rush out and try to save the animal. At the same time, Cartman secretly tells Denkins that a pair of dangerous pony killers are planning to come onto his land, describing Scott's parents without naming them directly. When Scott's mother and father show up at the farm that night to rescue the pony, believing they are doing something kind, Denkins shoots and kills both of them, believing he is defending his property from the threat Cartman warned him about. Cartman then sneaks onto the farm before anyone else discovers the bodies, steals both corpses, and spends the entire night grinding them into pieces small enough to hide inside a pot of chili. The next day, he invites Scott over, tells him his parents have died, and reveals that the chili Scott has already been eating throughout the visit is made from his own mother and father. Scott finds one of his mother's fingers in his bowl. He begins sobbing uncontrollably. Cartman, rather than showing any sign of guilt, leans in and licks the tears directly off Scott's face, calling them tears of unfathomable sadness. The The episode ends with Stan and Kyle, both horrified by what they just witnessed, quietly agreeing between themselves that they will never make Cartman this angry again for as long as they live. Parker and Stone have spoken openly about how difficult a decision this storyline was to write. According to their own comments, the two of them debated at length whether it was even acceptable to have a 4th grade character be responsible for killing 2 adults and feeding their remains to their own son. They recognized it as a massive jump for the character and for the show as a whole, a moment that would set an entirely new bar for how dark South Park was willing to go. After going back and forth on the idea, they eventually decided to move forward with it, but only after making one important decision about how the plan would actually play out on screen. They made sure that Cartman himself never pulls the trigger. He tricks another person, Denkins, into doing the actual killing, which lets Cartman orchestrate 2 deaths without ever directly committing the act himself. This detail matters a great deal for understanding exactly what kind of character Cartman had become at this point. He is not simply violent in a direct, obvious way. He is patient enough to build a plan where someone else does the killing for him while he stands back clean and watches the pieces fall into place exactly as he designed them. The episode also marked a turning point in how South Park itself was structured from a writing standpoint. Nearly every episode before this one had juggled at least 2 separate storylines running side by side. Often a main plot involving the boys paired with a smaller, unrelated subplot involving the adults of the town. Scott Tenorman Must Die broke from that pattern entirely, focusing on a single storyline from beginning to end with no subplot running alongside it. Parker and Stone have said that they were initially nervous about this choice, worried that removing the subplot would leave the episode feeling thin or unbalanced. Once they finished the episode, they realized the opposite was true. A single, tightly focused story allowed the tension between Cartman and Scott to build without interruption, giving the ending far more impact than it would have carried if the episode had kept cutting away to some unrelated joke happening elsewhere in town. Following this episode, many later South Park episodes adopted the same approach, focusing on one central plot rather than splitting attention across several smaller ones, which shows just how much of an influence this single episode had on the way the entire show was written going forward. For 9 full seasons after this episode aired, the story of Scott Tenorman appeared to be finished. Scott shows up again briefly in a later episode called The Death of Eric Cartman, where he is shown crying at his parents' grave, while Cartman awkwardly hands him a fruit basket as a half-hearted attempt at an apology. Beyond that one small moment, the character mostly disappears from the show for years, and the horror of what happened to him seems to fade into the background the way most one-episode conflicts on South Park usually do. Then, in 2010, during the show's landmark 200th and 201st episodes, the story returns in a way nobody watching back in 2001 could have predicted. Scott reappears as an adult, revealed to have spent years inside a mental institution after the trauma of losing his parents, and unknowingly eating them completely broke his mind. During his time there, he became fixated on researching every detail of Cartman's life, determined to find some way to get real revenge for what had been done to him. While digging through old records and town history, Scott discovers something that changes everything about the story. His own father, Jack Tenorman, had once played right tackle for the Denver Broncos before settling down in South Park. Years earlier, during a town event called the Drunken Barn Dance, Jack had an affair with a woman named Leanne Cartman. That affair resulted in a pregnancy, and that pregnancy resulted in Eric Cartman. The show reveals that the entire town had known about this secret for years, and had actively worked together to cover it up. According to the story, the Broncos were having an unusually good season around the time the truth might have come out, and the town decided that revealing a star player's secret illegitimate child born from an affair would create a distraction the team could not afford during such an important year. Rather than letting the truth come out, the town altered official paternity test results and told young Cartman a different story entirely, claiming that his mother was somehow both his mother and his father due to a rare medical condition. This bizarre explanation actually appears in 2 earlier episodes from season 1, titled Cartman's Mom is a Dirty Slut and Cartman's Mom is Still a Dirty Slut, which planted small hints about a mystery Denver Bronco being involved in Cartman's birth nearly a decade before the full truth was ever revealed. Watching those 2 early episodes again with this later knowledge in mind, the hints are there the entire time, sitting quietly in the background of jokes that originally seemed to be about something else entirely. Once Scott uncovers the full truth, he sets his plan into motion. He revives an old hate group that Cartman himself had created years earlier called the Ginger Separatist Movement, made up of red-haired kids who had been mocked and mistreated by other students, hoping to use the group's numbers and anger murder as a tool in his revenge scheme. His ultimate goal is to reveal Cartman's true parentage publicly, forcing him to face the fact that the man he unknowingly murdered 9 years earlier and ground into chili was in fact his own biological father. When the truth is finally revealed to Cartman directly, his reaction is not what most viewers might expect from a boy learning he killed his own dad. Rather than expressing horror or grief over the murder itself, Cartman becomes far more upset by the fact that Jack Tennerman had red hair, which means Cartman himself is now by blood part ginger, a group he has spent years mocking and treating as inferior to everyone else. He uses this ridiculous detail as a shield, loudly complaining about being part ginger as a way to avoid confronting the much heavier truth sitting underneath it. Later, Cartman finds a strange kind of comfort in learning that his biological father was a professional football player, holding on to that detail as something he can feel proud of, seemingly untouched by the fact that this same man is dead specifically because Cartman had him killed nearly a decade earlier. This response says a great deal about how Cartman's mind works, and it lines up closely with patterns discussed regarding his psychology in earlier sections. A normal person learning that they accidentally murdered and ate their own father would likely be consumed by grief, guilt, or horror, probably all three at once. Cartman experiences none of that in any visible way. His focus shifts almost immediately toward how the news affects his own personal identity and reputation, rather than toward the deeper, darker truth about what he actually did to another human being, a human being who turns out to have shared his own blood. This reaction fits a pattern that plays out again and again throughout the show, where Cartman consistently reframes any serious situation around his own feelings and his own image, no matter how much genuine tragedy might be sitting directly underneath the surface of that situation. The long-term effects of this revelation continue showing up in later seasons of the show as well. Writers and fans alike have pointed out that Cartman effectively erased his own chance at ever having a real father in his life, all because of a decision made purely out of anger over $10 and some pubic hair when he was still in the 4th grade. Had Jack Tennerman lived, there exists at least a small possibility that Cartman could have eventually received financial support from him, or even some form of relationship, however distant or complicated it might have turned out to be. Instead, that possibility was destroyed permanently the moment Cartman decided that revenge over $10 was worth 2 human lives. Some critics analyzing the show have connected this directly to a much later storyline from season 25, where Cartman and his mother are shown struggling financially, and are forced to temporarily move into an abandoned diner due to money troubles. While the show never states this connection outright on screen, the timeline itself lines up in a way that feels difficult to ignore. A father who might have provided some form of support died specifically because his own son had him killed nearly 2 decades earlier over what amounts to a minor schoolyard conflict. The episode 201 also reveals one final detail that adds an extra layer of darkness to the entire story. Scott's plan to reveal the truth about Cartman's father was never really about giving Cartman closure or helping him understand his own past. It was built entirely as an act of psychological revenge, designed specifically to hurt Cartman as deeply as possible by forcing him to face the fact that he had murdered his own biological father without ever knowing it. In this sense, the plan works exactly as intended, though not quite in the way Scott originally hoped. Cartman is hurt by the revelation, but true to form, he manages to twist even this pain into something he can process through his own strange, selfish lens, focusing on football and ginger hair rather than on the human cost of what he actually did nearly a decade earlier. Taken together, these 2 episodes, separated by nearly 9 years of real time, form one of the longest running and most carefully hidden storylines the show has ever built. What began as a seemingly standalone episode about a 4th grader getting revenge over $10 turned out to be the opening chapter of a much larger, darker story about identity, family, and the kind of permanent damage that can come from decisions made in a moment of pure childhood anger. Very few shows manage to plant a secret this significant nearly a decade before paying it off, and even fewer manage to do it while keeping the earlier hints so well hidden that most viewers never noticed them until the truth finally came out. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This same pattern of hidden damage and long-delayed consequences shows up again in a completely different area of Cartman's life, one involving a real relationship built on manipulation that critics have compared directly to patterns of abuse seen in real relationships between real people. Section 4. The Cartman and Heidi relationship copied a real pattern of abuse almost exactly. Season 20 of South Park introduced a storyline that started off looking like a small, sweet sweet moment of growth for two characters who had spent years being pushed to the edges of the show. By the time the storyline finished playing out across 3 more seasons, it had turned into one of the most detailed and accurate depictions of an abusive relationship ever shown on a cartoon aimed at adults. The relationship between Eric Cartman and Heidi Turner did not follow the usual formula most shows use for romance between two characters. It followed, almost step by step, a pattern that real counselors and writers who study relationships recognize immediately, and several people with direct experience or training in this area have written about the storyline specifically because of how closely it matches real life. Heidi Turner began the show as a minor background character, rarely given lines or attention across the first 19 seasons. She gained real focus starting in season 20, when the show built a storyline around online bullying targeting the girls at South Park Elementary. A user calling himself SkankHunt42 begins harassing the girls through anonymous messages, and Heidi becomes one of his main targets. The harassment eventually pushes her to delete her social media accounts entirely, leaving her feeling isolated from a huge part of her social life. Around the same time, Cartman, unrelated to the bullying storyline at first, loses access to his own phone and computer as a punishment from his mother. Both characters end up cut off from the online world at the same time, and this shared isolation becomes the strange, accidental starting point of their relationship. They begin spending time together, comforting each other over feeling left out, and slowly grow close. Heidi later plays a role in resolving a strange argument Cartman has been having about whether girls have testicles, and this moment becomes something the show frames as a turning point, after which the two officially become a couple. At first, the relationship is shown as warm and even sweet by South Park standards. The two hold hands constantly, use pet names like Boo and Babe, and defend each other against classmates who find the entire pairing strange or unbelievable, given everything the show has established about Cartman over the years. This early period matters a great deal for understanding everything that comes afterward, because real relationship experts who study patterns of abuse point out again and again that abusive relationships almost never begin looking abusive. They tend to begin with intense affection, constant praise, and a level of attention that can feel flattering and exciting, especially to someone who has recently gone through something painful, like Heidi's experience with online harassment. Cartman is shown during this period telling Heidi repeatedly how smart and how funny she is, with the show placing particular focus on how much he seems to value her sense of humor specifically. Writers analyzing this storyline later pointed out that this early flood of praise, especially around a specific trait like humor, becomes important once the relationship eventually turns cruel, because that exact same trait becomes one of the first things Cartman begins attacking once his behavior shifts. The turn happens gradually rather than all at once, which mirrors another pattern real experts describe when discussing abusive relationships. Cartman does not suddenly become cruel overnight. Small moments of annoyance and distance creep in first. He begins acting cold or short with Heidi over minor things, growing visibly irritated when she wants to talk about her own interests or spend time on things that do not directly involve him. In one episode, Heidi enters Cartman's house only to be met with passive-aggressive comments that leave her confused and hurt, since nothing about the interaction gives her any clear reason for his sudden coldness. She leaves upset that he refuses to explain what is actually bothering him. Later that same night, when she calls to check on things, he brings up something small and unrelated, something he claims she said about phones being bad for people, despite using his own phone constantly himself. He hangs up on her shortly after, clearly annoyed, even after wishing her a stiff goodnight moments earlier. Around the same time, Cartman begins telling his friends a completely different version of the relationship than what is actually happening. He describes Heidi to the other boys as someone who changes moods without warning, comparing her to a well-known story about a person with two completely different personalities, and claims she mentally abuses him and needs help, despite nothing in the show ever supporting this claim as true. This detail matters enormously, because flipping the story to make the actual victim sound like the abuser is one of the clearest and most well-documented tactics real abusers use to control how people around them see the relationship. The situation escalates significantly further as the storyline continues into season 21. In one especially telling episode, Heidi confronts Cartman directly about something specific he did, telling him plainly that he called her a whore and pushed her in front of a moving car. Cartman's entire response to this serious accusation is a single, dismissive line, claiming he was simply in a bad mood at the time, as if a bad mood explains away shoving someone into traffic. This single exchange, brief as it is, captures something real relationship experts describe constantly when discussing patterns of abuse. Serious, even dangerous behavior gets reduced down to a small, forgivable excuse, delivered with just enough casual confidence that the other person is is left questioning whether they are overreacting to something the abuser has already decided was nothing. From this point forward, the show builds out a full and detailed cycle that repeats itself across multiple episodes, and this cycle lines up almost perfectly with patterns described by writers and counselors who study abusive relationships for a living. Cartman treats Heidi poorly, often behind her back, complaining to his friends about her and mocking her appearance and intelligence when she is not around to hear it, while still acting warmly toward her whenever she is physically present. When Heidi finally reaches a breaking point and tries to end the relationship, Cartman does not simply accept it and move on. He becomes deeply upset, pleading with her to reconsider, and eventually begins blaming his own bad behavior on outside factors rather than taking any real responsibility. In one storyline, he specifically blames his anger and cruelty on his diet, claiming that his mother feeding him unhealthy food throughout his life has messed with his blood sugar in a way that causes his behavior, shifting responsibility away from himself entirely and onto his mother instead. Heidi, wanting badly to believe that the relationship can be fixed and that Cartman is capable of real change, suggests that he try eating healthier food, hoping this might genuinely help. Cartman agrees enthusiastically, making big promises about wanting to change and improve for her sake. This moment fits a pattern real experts describe often, where an abuser, faced with the possibility of losing control over a relationship, suddenly becomes extremely agreeable and willing to make grand promises, not necessarily because they intend to follow through, but because agreeing in the moment keeps the relationship from ending. What Cartman actually does with this promise reveals exactly how hollow it really is. Rather than making any genuine change to how he eats or how he treats Heidi, he begins secretly writing the word Beyond, referencing a well-known brand of plant-based meat directly onto boxes of regular fast food, passing off greasy, unhealthy meals as the healthier alternative he promised to eat. He even brings Heidi a bucket of fried chicken at one point, insisting it counts as vegan food under this same fake label, and tells her directly that she cannot even tell the difference as he pushes food into her face. This scene captures something important about how Cartman approaches every promise he makes throughout this entire relationship. For him, the goal was never actual change. The goal was always finding the easiest possible way to appear as though he is trying, just enough to keep Heidi from leaving, without ever putting in any real effort toward the thing he claimed he wanted to fix. The relationship reaches its most serious and disturbing point when Cartman begins using threats of suicide specifically to prevent Heidi from ending things permanently. After one particularly painful breakup, Cartman leaves Heidi a voicemail message directly threatening to kill himself if she refuses to take him back. Heidi, genuinely frightened and concerned for his safety despite everything he has already put her through, gets back together with him almost immediately. This exact tactic, using threats of self-harm specifically to control another person's decisions, is recognized by real experts as one of the most serious and dangerous forms of manipulation that can appear inside an abusive relationship, precisely because it works by exploiting the other person's genuine care and concern against them. Heidi cannot simply walk away without feeling responsible for whatever might happen next, which traps her far more effectively than almost any other tactic Cartman has used up to this point. The show does not stop there. In a Halloween episode, Cartman actively works to remove Heidi from his life entirely, but rather than simply breaking up with her honestly, he builds an elaborate and overly complicated scheme, tricking her into following him deep into the woods before abandoning her there, apparently hoping she will not find her way back. The reason behind this extreme decision turns out to be shockingly small. Heidi had taken slightly too long getting ready for a pumpkin patch outing, an inconvenience that most people would barely register as annoying, let alone worth abandoning someone in the woods over. This moment highlights something important about the overall pattern the show is depicting. The severity of Cartman's response almost never matches the size of whatever supposedly upset him in the first place. Another detail real experts point to constantly when describing how abusive behavior actually functions in practice. Perhaps the clearest and most direct piece of writing addressing this entire storyline comes from an essay published shortly after these episodes aired, written specifically about the emotional abuse patterns shown between the two characters. The essay points out that Cartman has always carried nearly every negative trait a person can have, but argues that his relationship with Heidi reveals something deeper sitting underneath his more obvious flaws, something closer to what real experts describe as an extreme form of self-centeredness paired with an inability to accept any personal blame. According to this essay, Cartman consistently manages to convince himself in nearly every single situation that he is somehow the true victim, no matter how clearly the actual facts point in the opposite direction. He works just as hard convincing the people around him of this same twisted version of events. The essay describes this pattern directly, repeatedly, pointing out that Cartman appears able to become the victim in any situation simply by trying hard enough, and that this exact strategy allows him to escape feeling responsible for nearly everything harmful he does throughout the entire relationship. The essay also describes something particularly striking about how quickly and drastically Cartman's behavior shifts once he feels secure in the relationship. At the very beginning, he idolizes Heidi completely, showering her with constant compliments and making her feel more valued than she has perhaps ever felt in her life up to that point. Then, almost without warning, his attitude flips entirely. He grows visibly annoyed by her presence, begins actively tearing her down rather than building her up, and shows open irritation at things she used to seem to genuinely enjoy about her. The essay points out that this pattern, while it can look sudden and confusing from the outside, actually represents a well-recognized stage that abusive relationships often follow. The intense early praise serves a real purpose beyond simple affection. It builds trust and emotional investment first, making the later cruelty far harder for the other person to walk away from once it eventually begins, since so much good feeling has already been built up and invested into the relationship by that point. Beyond simple emotional cruelty, the relationship eventually escalates into moments of genuine physical danger as well. Across the various episodes covering this storyline, Cartman is shown pushing Heidi in front of a moving car, and later attempting, through a strange and convoluted scheme involving a witch character, to have her taken away entirely, seemingly hoping she might not return at all. These moments push the storyline well beyond simple emotional manipulation and into territory the show clearly frames as dangerous, even though it maintains its usual absurd, exaggerated cartoon style throughout every single scene. The contrast between the outrageous, cartoonish presentation and the very real, very serious pattern being depicted underneath it is likely exactly why so many writers and viewers with real-world experience or training around abusive relationships found this particular storyline worth writing about so extensively. Heidi's own transformation across these seasons adds another important and carefully observed layer to the entire story. As the relationship progresses, she begins slowly adopting many of Cartman's own worst traits, growing increasingly self-centered, lazy, and unhealthy in her own habits, largely as a direct result of spending so much time around his influence. By a certain point in the storyline, the show depicts her as having become almost a mirror image of Cartman himself, having gained a significant amount of weight from adopting his poor eating habits, and having grown noticeably louder and more demanding in how she treats the people around her. This transformation matches something real experts frequently describe when studying long-term abusive relationships, where the person being controlled gradually begins absorbing certain traits or behaviors of the person controlling them, sometimes as an unconscious survival strategy, and sometimes simply because constant exposure to a certain way of behaving slowly reshapes a person's own habits over enough time. The relationship finally reaches its breaking point during the season 21 finale. Heidi, having reached her absolute limit, steals a gun from another character and holds Cartman at gunpoint, directly blaming him for the person she feels she has become over the course of their relationship. In this moment, rather than caving to fear or guilt as he has so many times before, Cartman attempts his familiar suicide threat tactic one final time, clearly expecting it to work exactly the way it always has in the past. This time, however, Heidi sees through the manipulation completely. She recognizes the exact tactic for what it truly is, having lived through it enough times by this point to finally understand the pattern clearly, and the attempt fails to have any effect on her at all. Rather than pulling the trigger or giving in to more manipulation, Heidi instead comes to a much deeper and more important realization on her own. She acknowledges that Cartman was never solely responsible for the negative person she had slowly become throughout the relationship. She recognizes that she herself made a series of choices along the way, and that continuing to view herself purely as a victim, without taking any ownership of her own part in the situation, was preventing her from actually moving forward and rebuilding her own life. With this realization firmly in place, she finally ends the relationship for good. Critics and writers who covered this storyline at the time it originally aired noted that the entire arc also functioned as a pointed political comparison, released during a period when the show was actively satirizing the presidency and drawing direct parallels between Cartman's controlling behavior toward Heidi and the loyalty many political supporters continued showing toward a leader despite clear and repeated evidence of harmful behavior. Whether or not a viewer catches this deeper political layer while watching, the relationship works perfectly well entirely on its own as a piece of writing, specifically about how abusive relationships actually function in real life. Built with a level of accuracy that multiple writers with direct expertise in this exact subject have have pointed out and written about extensively in the years since these episodes first aired. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This same pattern of Cartman hiding real cruelty behind a mask of apparent innocence or apparent goodness connects directly to a much wider theory about his character, one suggesting that his so-called stupidity might be one of the most carefully calculated performances the entire show has ever built. Section 5. Cartman's stupidity is a costume he puts on and takes off. Cartman spends a huge amount of screen time across South Park acting like the dumbest kid in class. He mangles basic facts, misunderstands simple instructions, and regularly says things so wrong that even his own friends stop to correct him. Viewers who only catch a handful of episodes here and there could easily walk away thinking Cartman is simply not very bright, a loud kid coasting on volume rather than brains. Looking closely at the show's full run tells a very different story. Underneath the constant noise and the constant wrong answers sits a boy who builds some of the most detailed, patient, and genuinely clever plans of any character on the show. Plans that require real intelligence to design and real discipline to carry out. The show itself has pointed to this contradiction directly, describing a pattern where Cartman does something that looks selfless on the surface, only for that selfless act to reveal itself later as cover for a far more selfish plan running underneath. That single detail, repeated across dozens of episodes and multiple decades, tells a clear story. Cartman is not actually as stupid as he lets people believe. He has simply figured out that being underestimated gives him an advantage almost nobody else on the show gets to use. The clearest example of this pattern comes from the season 8 episode Awesome-O. In this episode, Cartman wants to find out what embarrassing secrets his friend Butters might be hiding, so he builds himself a full robot costume, complete with a robotic voice and stiff mechanical movements, and convinces Butters that he is an actual robot named Awesome-O. This alone requires a level of patience most 10-year-olds simply do not have. Cartman does not just wear the costume for a single scene. He commits to the disguise for days at a time, sleeping in it, eating in it, and maintaining the robotic voice and movement pattern almost constantly, even when nobody else is around to see it slip. Butters, believing he has found a real robot, decides to bring Awesome-O to Hollywood, hoping to sell the idea to movie studios. Rather than breaking character and admitting the truth once things escalate far beyond what he originally planned, Cartman keeps the act going, improvising an entirely new set of lies on the spot to keep the scheme alive, eventually pitching several fake movie ideas to real studio executives while still fully dressed as a robot. The plan only falls apart because Cartman's own greed gets the better of him near the end, when he breaks character just briefly enough to demand cash directly, giving away the fact that he was never a robot in the first place. Even this failure says something important. Cartman did not get caught because his plan was poorly built. He got caught because he could not resist one final selfish move once the opportunity for personal gain appeared directly in front of him. The plan itself, up until that final moment, worked exactly as designed for days on end. A robot costume covering an entire body cannot easily be removed for eating, sleeping, or using a bathroom without someone eventually noticing gaps in the performance. Cartman maintains the illusion through all of these ordinary daily needs, adjusting his voice, his walk, and his reactions constantly so that nothing slips in front of Butters. Most children asked to hold a single lie for even one full day tend to slip somewhere, forgetting a detail or breaking character out of boredom. Cartman holds an entire physical performance together for what the episode presents as several days straight, adjusting his story each time a new complication threatens to expose him. When Butters unexpectedly brings the robot idea to real movie executives, Cartman does not panic or freeze. He immediately begins inventing entire movie plots on the spot, speaking in character the whole time, showing a kind of quick thinking under pressure that has nothing to do with being slow or foolish. A similar pattern shows up in the season 5 episode Cartman Land, where Cartman inherits a large sum of money from his grandmother and uses it to buy an entire amusement park, purely so he can enjoy the rides without anyone else around to bother him. Running an amusement park, even a fictional one built for a cartoon, requires understanding basic business operations, something the show has Cartman pick up with surprising speed once money and personal enjoyment are on the line. He manages staff, handles daily park operations, and even deals with a serious financial problem involving unpaid taxes once government officials show up demanding money he owes. None of this fits the profile of a genuinely stupid child. It fits the profile of someone who becomes sharp and capable extremely quickly whenever the reward is something he personally wants badly enough. A theme park needs staff scheduled, rides maintained, and money tracked well enough to keep the the entire operation from collapsing under its own costs. Cartman handles all of this without any adult guidance shown on screen, and when the government arrives demanding unpaid taxes, a problem that trips up plenty of real adults, he engages with it directly rather than collapsing into confused, childish panic. A boy who genuinely could not follow simple instructions in a classroom setting would have no realistic path toward independently operating a business complicated enough to attract the attention of tax officials in the first place. The Coon storyline, which runs across several seasons starting in season 13, offers some of the clearest evidence of just how far Cartman is willing to plan ahead when it benefits him. Taking on the identity of a costumed vigilante called the Coon, Cartman builds an entire secret operation around trying to uncover the true identity of a rival vigilante named Mysterion. At one point during this storyline, he plants explosives inside a hospital specifically as a trap designed to lure Mysterion out into the open, a plan that requires real strategic thinking about how to bait another person into revealing themselves. He eventually abandons this particular plot once he decides that working alongside Mysterion would serve his goals better than fighting him, showing a willingness to shift strategy the moment new information changes what the smartest move actually looks like. This kind of flexible, goal-focused thinking does not match the profile of someone acting purely on impulse. It matches the profile of someone constantly calculating which path gets him closer to whatever he currently wants most. Maintaining a secret vigilante persona across multiple seasons requires a level of long-term consistency that goes far beyond a single episode scheme. Cartman builds an entire costume, invents an origin story, and maintains a secret identity separate from his daily life at school, tracking who knows about his double life and who does not across dozens of separate episodes. He studies the other masked characters around him, working out their patterns and weaknesses well enough to attempt to identify Mysterion specifically, a mystery that takes real detective-style thinking to even attempt seriously. Pride and ego drive much of his public behavior, yet in this specific storyline, once a clearly better strategic option appears, he sets aside the fight quickly rather than stubbornly continuing a losing approach purely to save face. That kind of practical, results-focused thinking rarely shows up in characters written as genuinely unintelligent, since real stupidity tends to cling to a failing plan out of confusion rather than abandon it the moment a smarter option becomes clear. Beyond these individual episodes, the show has built other details into Cartman's character over the years that only make sense if his intelligence runs deeper than his public behavior suggests. According to the show's own official character information, Cartman is shown to be fluent in multiple different languages, a skill that takes real effort and real mental capability to develop, even inside the exaggerated world of a cartoon. Learning a single new language well enough to speak it fluently takes most people years of steady effort, even with structured lessons and regular practice. Nothing in the show ever depicts Cartman sitting through language classes or studying with any real discipline in front of the camera, and yet this skill appears fully formed whenever a specific episode calls for it. A detail like this rarely gets included in a character purely by accident, especially across a show written by two people who have controlled nearly every creative decision involving Cartman personally since the very beginning. One particularly telling episode involves Cartman's scheme against his friend Butters in a storyline called My Future Self and Me. In this episode, Cartman grows jealous after learning that Butters has come up with an idea he considers better than his own. Rather than simply competing directly, Cartman builds an elaborate and carefully staged hoax, hiring adult actors to pose as older, future versions of Butters and his own future self, using the fake future selves to scare Butters into behaving a certain way by showing him a frightening vision of what his life will supposedly become if he continues making certain choices. Setting up a scheme like this requires finding and paying actual actors, coaching them on exactly what to say and how to act, and coordinating the entire performance well enough that a real child watching it would find the whole thing believable. This is not a simple prank thrown together in a single afternoon. Every piece of this plan depends on careful preparation completed well before the actual scheme ever plays out on screen. The kind of advanced planning that takes real organization and real follow-through, rather than the impulsive, scattered thinking Cartman displays constantly in his everyday interactions with his friends. The pattern extends into smaller, quieter moments throughout the show as well. Moments that rarely get as much attention as the bigger, more dramatic episodes, but that reveal the same basic truth every time they appear. Cartman regularly identifies the exact weak point in another person's personality and applies pressure there with real precision. He understands that Butters craves approval and fears getting in trouble more than almost anything else, and he uses that fear constantly to control him throughout dozens of separate episodes across many different seasons. He understands that his mother will give in to nearly any demand if he applies enough pressure or performs enough manufactured sadness, and he uses this knowledge constantly to get exactly what he wants from her. He understands that adults in positions of authority tend to underestimate children entirely, assuming kids are simply too young to construct anything resembling a real functioning plan. Cartman exploits this blind spot again and again throughout the show. He knows exactly which comments will make Kyle angry enough to lose focus during an argument, and he knows exactly how to frame a request to his mother so that refusing feels harder than simply giving in. A person genuinely lacking basic intelligence could not sustain this kind of individually tailored manipulation across so many different relationships for so many years without eventually slipping and applying the wrong approach to the wrong person. None of this means Cartman is secretly some kind of genius operating on a level above everyone else around him. His plans fail constantly, often at the very last moment, and usually because of factors he either failed to consider or because another character, most often Kyle, manages to see through the scheme before it fully plays out. According to the show's own character information, Cartman usually faces real consequences specifically because his schemes contain some kind of flaw, or because other characters end up proving smarter than him in the end. This detail actually strengthens the overall theory rather than weakening it. A character whose plans always worked perfectly would feel less like a believable person and more like an unstoppable villain with no real weaknesses. Cartman's plans working well enough to be genuinely dangerous, while still containing real flaws that eventually catch up with him, paints a picture of someone operating with real intelligence. Just intelligence that remains limited by his own overconfidence, his own greed, and his own inability to stop pushing a scheme even after it has already succeeded. This overconfidence shows up constantly as the actual reason his plans eventually collapse, rather than any lack of intelligence in the planning itself. In Awesome-O, the plan works perfectly for days, only falling apart once Cartman gets greedy and breaks character to demand money directly. In Scott Tenorman Must Die, discussed earlier, the plan works exactly as designed from start to finish, with no flaw at all, showing that when Cartman commits fully to patience and discipline, his schemes can succeed completely without a single mistake. A similar pattern shows up in the Casa Bonita scheme, mentioned elsewhere in this discussion regarding his home life, where Cartman builds an elaborate lie about terrorists specifically to keep Butters trapped in a cellar overnight, so he misses Kyle's birthday party. The lie holds up for an extended stretch of time, convincing enough that Butters genuinely believes real danger surrounds them both. The scheme only spirals out of control because Cartman himself becomes physically trapped in the same situation he built. Even here, the failure traces back to a planning gap rather than any lack of basic cleverness. Writers who have studied Cartman's character closely have pointed directly to this exact contradiction as one of the more interesting layers hiding underneath the show's comedy. A character constantly written as loud and foolish, who nonetheless manages to build genuinely functional long-term plans involving disguises, hired actors, financial schemes, and careful psychological manipulation of both children and adults, cannot honestly be described as simply unintelligent. The stupidity that Cartman performs constantly throughout the show appears to function as a kind of shield. People who assume someone is not very smart tend to lower their guard around that person, expecting less from them and watching them less closely. Cartman seems to understand this dynamic on some level, and he uses the assumption of his own stupidity as cover for schemes that a genuinely unintelligent child could never actually pull off. This shield works especially well on adults specifically. Teachers, parents, and random strangers across the show consistently treat Cartman as a harmless, foolish kid not worth taking seriously, an assumption that gives him enormous room to operate without close supervision. Children his own age, particularly Kyle, tend to see through his tricks far more often, since years of first-hand experience with his schemes have taught them exactly what warning signs to watch for. This theory also helps explain something that can otherwise feel confusing about Cartman's character across the show's full run. He fails constantly, gets humiliated regularly, and rarely seems to learn any lasting lesson from these failures. All details discussed in earlier sections regarding his resistance to real personal growth. At the same time, he manages to build multilingual fluency, run a functioning business, coordinate hired actors for elaborate hoaxes, and maintain complex disguises for days at a stretch without slipping. Cartman is not simply dumb, and he is not simply a hidden genius either. He is a character whose intelligence gets applied unevenly, showing up in full force whenever a scheme serves his own immediate once, while almost completely disappearing the moment a situation requires patience, humility, or actual learning from a past mistake. His mind works exceptionally well in service of manipulation and personal gain. It works far worse in service of genuine self-improvement, since that goal requires exactly the kind of humility and self-awareness that Cartman has shown almost no interest in developing across nearly 30 years of episodes. This uneven pattern becomes clearer once measured against Kyle specifically. Kyle's cleverness tends to show up in service of fairness, logic, and solving problems that benefit people beyond just himself. Cartman's cleverness shows up almost exclusively when a scheme benefits him personally, disappearing almost entirely the moment a situation calls for patience towards someone else's needs rather than his own. Looking back across every major scheme discussed so far, from the robot disguise in Awesome-O, to the amusement park business in Cartman Land, to the hired actors in My Future Self and Me, to the calculated bombing plot during the Coon storyline, a clear picture comes into focus. Cartman consistently underestimates how well other people, especially adults, will eventually see through his plans, and this overconfidence remains his single biggest weakness throughout the entire show. His actual planning ability, though, the raw skill involved in constructing these schemes in the first place, stays remarkably consistent and remarkably sharp across every single decade the show has aired. A child who was genuinely as slow and as foolish as Cartman constantly presents himself to be simply could not build plans this detailed, this patient, or this psychologically precise, no matter how many attempts he made. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This raises an important question about where exactly this sharp, calculating side of Cartman actually came from in the first place, since intelligence and manipulation skill this refined rarely develop in a complete vacuum. Every pattern examined so far, from his complete lack of guilt to his skill at reading and exploiting other people's weaknesses, traces back to the same starting point discussed briefly in an earlier section: the home he grew up in and the woman who raised him without ever once telling him no. Section 6. Leanne Cartman never once told her son no. Every pattern discussed so far, the manipulation, the lack of guilt, the total inability to accept blame for anything, traces back to one single environment. Eric Cartman was raised by a mother who has spent nearly 30 years of the show giving him exactly what he wants, no matter how badly he treats her in return. South Park has never hidden this detail or buried it inside some deeper mystery the way it did with Cartman's father. The show puts Leanne Cartman's parenting on full display constantly, almost as if daring the audience to notice how directly her behavior connects to the son she raised. Leanne Cartman is Eric's single mother, and across the show's entire run, she is shown giving him nearly anything he asks for, regardless of the cost or the reasonableness of the request. She buys him expensive toys, funds elaborate outings, and rarely says no to any demand he places on her, even when those demands come wrapped in tantrums, threats, or outright cruelty directed straight at her. This pattern shows up so often across so many separate episodes that it has become one of the most consistent facts about Cartman's home life, right alongside the mystery surrounding his father discussed earlier. One of the clearest examples of this pattern comes from a season 7 episode called Casa Bonita. In this episode, Cartman becomes desperate to celebrate his birthday at a restaurant called Casa Bonita, a real Mexican restaurant chain known for its cliff divers and elaborate decorations, after learning that his rival Kyle is planning to hold his own birthday party there first. When Cartman realizes he has been left off the guest list for Kyle's party, he panics and comes up with an elaborate lie, convincing his classmate Butters that a group of terrorists are hunting them down. Also that Butters will hide with him in a cellar overnight rather than attend Kyle's party at the restaurant. The scheme spirals out of control when Cartman himself becomes trapped and is later mistaken for a real missing child, leading to a serious police search and Cartman spending time inside a facility meant to help troubled children process trauma. Rather than treating this as a moment requiring real discipline or a serious conversation about honesty and manipulation, Leanne rushes to bring her son home the moment she is able to, showing no real follow-through on holding him accountable for the chaos and fear he caused an entire town. The pattern established here repeats constantly throughout the show. Cartman causes serious harm or serious disruption through a scheme built entirely around his own selfish wants, and rather than facing any lasting consequence at home, he is welcomed back into a house where nothing about his behavior seems likely to change going forward. This same dynamic shows up from the very earliest seasons of the show as well. In one of the first season episodes, titled Cat Orgy, Leanne leaves Cartman in the care of his grandmother so that she can attend an adult party of her own, a detail that hints at a level of neglect sitting alongside alongside the overindulgence discussed elsewhere. This detail matters because it shows that Leanne's parenting problems are not limited to simply giving Cartman too much. She also appears frequently disengaged from actually raising him in any structured or consistent way, leaving him with relatives or letting him wander into situations with very little actual supervision. A parent who is both overly permissive when present and frequently absent creates a particularly difficult environment for a child to grow up inside, since the child receives almost no consistent boundary from either direction. Cartman gets nearly everything he wants when his mother is around, and gets little real guidance or structure when she is not, which leaves him without any real model for how normal limits or normal consequences are supposed to work. The show's own official description of Cartman's home life makes this connection directly, rather than leaving it as something viewers have to piece together entirely on their own. According to character information published about him, Cartman's flaws are described as a direct product of his environment, having been given everything from an early age, which led him to expect this kind of treatment as normal. His selfish and lazy behavior, the description states plainly, was rewarded rather than punished by his mother, who is described as being almost completely incapable of disciplining him, regardless of how much abuse she personally receives from him in return. This detail is worth sitting with directly, because it comes from an official summary of the character, rather than from outside analysis or fan theory. The show itself frames Leanne's failure to discipline her son as a central and defining fact about who Cartman became, placed right alongside his other core traits as one of the building blocks of his entire personality. The abuse Leanne receives from her own son runs in both directions across nearly every season of the show. Cartman regularly calls her insulting names, screams at her over minor inconveniences, and treats her with a level of open disrespect that would be considered deeply alarming coming from any real child toward any real parent. He blames her constantly for problems that have nothing to do with her, using her as a convenient target whenever he needs someone else to hold responsible for his own bad choices. This pattern connects directly to something discussed in the earlier section covering his relationship with Heidi Turner, where Cartman specifically blamed his own cruel behavior on his mother's cooking, claiming that the unhealthy food she fed him throughout his life had damaged his blood sugar in a way that explained his anger. Whether or not this claim holds any real truth, the instinct behind it says something important. Cartman's first move whenever his behavior gets challenged by anyone is to look for someone else to blame, and his mother sits at the very top of that list more often than anyone else in his life. Despite this constant stream of disrespect, Leanne rarely responds with any real correction or any lasting punishment. She continues providing for him, continues giving in to his demands, and continues showing up for him in whatever way he currently needs, regardless of how poorly he has just treated her. This creates a cycle that repeats itself across literally hundreds of episodes spanning multiple decades. Cartman mistreats his mother, faces no real consequence for doing so, and then continues that exact same behavior pattern the following week with no apparent change in how he views or treats her going forward. Writers who have studied Cartman's psychology, discussed in an earlier section covering the academic research built around his character, point directly to this parenting dynamic as one of the two competing explanations for why Cartman behaves the way he does. One explanation suggests that Cartman was simply born without the normal human capacity for empathy or guilt, showing signs of this from an extremely young age regardless of how he was raised. The other explanation, the one more directly supported by what the show actually depicts on screen, suggests that Cartman's complete lack of boundaries traces directly back to a childhood where boundaries were never meaningfully enforced in the first place. A child who learns early that bad behavior gets rewarded rather than corrected, and that even serious harm caused to other people results in no lasting consequence at home, has very little reason to ever develop real empathy or real restraint. Why would he, when every single lesson his home life has taught him points toward the opposite conclusion, that getting what he wants matters more than how he gets it, and that consequences are something other people deal with rather than something he ever really has to face himself. This explanation also helps make sense of a detail discussed in the section on Cartman's hidden intelligence, the pattern where he consistently underestimates how well other people will eventually see through his schemes. A child raised without real consequences at home has very little practice actually experiencing failure in any way that sticks. Cartman's plans fail constantly out in the world, at school, with his friends, with strangers he tries to manipulate, but none of those failures ever seem to carry back home in a way that teaches him anything lasting. His mother remains a constant, stable source of comfort and provision no matter what happens to him outside the house, which may explain why he never seems to genuinely absorb the lessons his failures should be teaching him. He always has a safe place to return to, one that asks nothing of him in exchange for that safety. There is also something worth examining in how the show frames Leanne herself, separate from her role purely as an enabling parent. She is shown across various episodes to have had a complicated and sometimes chaotic personal history, including the affair discussed in the earlier section covering Cartman's father, an affair that the entire town conspired to help cover up rather than support her through honestly. This detail adds a layer of context that some viewers and writers have pointed to when discussing her character, suggesting that Leanne herself may have grown up or lived through circumstances that left her poorly equipped to provide the kind of steady, consistent parenting a child like Cartman clearly needed from an early age. This does not excuse the pattern the show depicts, and the show itself never frames it as an excuse either. It simply adds another layer to a situation that already involves a town willing to lie about a child's paternity purely to protect a football season, suggesting that the entire community surrounding Cartman's childhood, not just his mother alone, failed repeatedly to provide him with the kind of honest, structured environment that might have shaped him into a very different person. The show occasionally hints at moments of real connection between Cartman and his mother, buried underneath all this dysfunction, moments that writers studying his psychology have pointed to directly when arguing against the idea that Cartman was simply born incapable of any real human attachment. Despite the constant abuse he directs at her, Cartman does show flashes of genuine need and even something resembling real affection toward his mother at certain points across the show's run. These moments are rare and often undercut quickly by a return to his usual cruelty, but their presence suggests that whatever damage has been done between them, some real bond still exists underneath it, twisted and unhealthy as that bond clearly is. This detail matters because it pushes back against a simpler reading of Cartman as someone incapable of caring about anyone besides himself. The relationship with his mother appears more complicated than that, carrying real dysfunction alongside real, if badly distorted, attachment. Looking at the full picture built across nearly 30 years of episodes, a clear through line connects Cartman's home life directly to nearly every other pattern discussed in earlier sections. His inability to accept blame connects to a home where blame never actually landed on him in any lasting way. His skill at manipulation connects to years of practice manipulating a parent who consistently gave in rather than held firm. His lack of guilt connects to a home life that never gave guilt any real room to take root, since nothing he did ever seemed to create consequences serious enough to force him into genuinely reflecting on his own behavior. Even his relationship with Heidi Turner, discussed in the earlier section covering that storyline, echoes this same basic pattern from a different angle. Cartman learned early, from his own mother, that enough pressure applied consistently enough will eventually break down almost any boundary another person tries to hold. He simply carried that same lesson forward into every relationship that followed, applying the exact strategy that worked so reliably at home to every other person unlucky enough to end up close to him. None of this means Leanne Cartman deserves to be blamed entirely for who her son became, and the show itself never frames the situation in such a simple, one-directional way. Cartman consistently makes his own choices throughout the show, choices no parent, however permissive, can fully account for on their own. A boy raised in a permissive home does not automatically become someone capable of orchestrating the death of two people, as discussed in the earlier section covering Scott Tenorman. That level of calculated cruelty involves something beyond simple bad parenting alone. What the show does suggest clearly, though, through nearly 30 years of consistent writing, is that Cartman's environment gave him every opportunity to become exactly who he eventually became, and took away nearly every opportunity he might have otherwise had to become someone different. A home with real boundaries, real consequences, and real accountability might not have fixed everything about Cartman, but it likely would have changed something, and the show seems fully aware of this possibility every time it shows Leanne giving in one more time to a son who has given her every reason not to. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This same question, whether Cartman could have ever turned out differently under different circumstances, connects directly to a much larger and more uncomfortable pattern the show keeps returning to across its entire run, one involving whether Cartman is even capable of changing at all, no matter what circumstances surround him. Section 7. Cartman never learns, and the show built him that way on purpose. Stan Marsh, Kyle Broflovsky, and Kenny McCormick have all changed across the run of South Park. Small changes, mostly, since the show has never wanted to turn any of them into fully different people, but real changes all the same. Stan has grown more willing to show real emotion, breaking down in tears in ways his character rarely allowed in earlier seasons. Kyle has grown into someone who consistently questions unfairness and and pushes back against it, sometimes at real personal cost. Even Butters, treated for years as the group's most naive and easily fooled member, has shown flashes of real growth, standing up for himself in certain episodes after years of being pushed around. Cartman sits completely outside this pattern. Across nearly 30 years and hundreds of episodes, he ends almost every single storyline in roughly the same place he started it, and the show appears to have built him this way entirely on purpose rather than by accident. The clearest way to see this pattern is to look at what happens right after Cartman faces a real setback. In the episode Awesemo, discussed in the earlier section covering his hidden intelligence, his elaborate robot disguise scheme collapses the moment his own greed pushes him to break character and demand cash. This should be, by any normal standard, a humiliating and costly failure, one that might reasonably push a person to rethink how they treat their friends, or how far they are willing to take a lie. The very next time Cartman appears in a later episode, none of that lesson carries forward. He returns to scheming against his friends with the same confidence and the same willingness to manipulate people close to him, as if the entire Awesemo disaster never happened at all. The show does not bring up the failure again, does not reference it as something Cartman thinks about, and gives no indication that the experience changed anything about how he approaches his next scheme. The same reset happens after Scott Tenorman Must Die, covered in detail in an earlier section. Killing two people and feeding their remains to their own son stands as one of the single darkest acts committed by any character across the entire show. Rather than this act haunting Cartman going forward, changing how he approaches conflict or revenge in future episodes, he continues scheming against people who annoy him in nearly identical ways for years afterward, treating minor slights with wildly disproportionate anger exactly the way he did before killing Scott's parents. When the truth about his father finally comes out 9 years later in 201, also covered earlier, Cartman's reaction focuses entirely on his own discomfort at learning he is part ginger, rather than on any real reckoning with the fact that he murdered his own father. Even a revelation this serious, delivered nearly a decade after the original crime, fails to produce any lasting change in how Cartman approaches the world around him. His relationship with Heidi Turner, covered in detail in an earlier section, shows this same pattern stretched out across an unusually long storyline. The relationship cycles through the same stages again and again: cruelty, breakup, manipulation, reconciliation, more cruelty, with almost no forward movement across the entire arc. A person capable of real change, even slow change, would likely show some small sign of improvement somewhere across the dozens of episodes this storyline spans. Cartman shows almost none. Heidi is the one who eventually grows and changes, recognizing the pattern for what it is and finally choosing to leave for good. Cartman, once the relationship ends, shows no clear evidence of having learned anything from the entire experience, and the show does not suggest he walks away from it a different person in any lasting way. Even genuine hardship fails to produce real change in him. In season 25, Cartman and his mother face serious financial trouble, forced to move temporarily into an abandoned diner after running into money problems. This kind of real-world hardship, losing a stable home and facing genuine uncertainty about basic needs, might reasonably be expected to humble a person or shift how they treat others around them. The show does not use this storyline to soften Cartman or push him toward any real personal growth. His core behavior continues largely unchanged, suggesting that even direct personal hardship falling on Cartman himself is not enough to meaningfully alter how he operates once the immediate crisis passes. This pattern becomes especially clear when placed directly next to how the show treats its other core characters. Kenny McCormick offers a particularly interesting comparison, since Kenny is famous for dying repeatedly across the show's early seasons, always returning completely unharmed and unaffected by his own previous death. This specific gimmick is often the first thing casual viewers think of when Kenny's name comes up, but it actually works as the exact opposite of what happens with Cartman. Kenny's resets are purely physical, a comedic device built around his body returning to normal after violent, often absurd deaths. His personality and his relationships with his friends continue developing steadily underneath this physical gimmick, especially once his secret identity as the vigilante Mysterion becomes central to several major storylines later in the show. Cartman's resets resets work in the opposite direction entirely. His body carries forward completely normally from episode to episode, with no physical gimmick resetting anything about him. It is his character, his personality, his capacity to learn and grow that resets instead, episode after episode, year after year, no matter what he goes through. Writers examining Cartman's psychology, discussed in the earlier section covering the academic research built specifically around his character, point directly to this pattern as one of the clearest signals used to identify certain concerning behavior patterns in real children. An inability to learn from consequences over a long stretch of time, even after facing setbacks serious enough that most people would clearly absorb some lesson from them, stands out as one of the most consistent warning signs doctors are trained to look for. Cartman displays this exact pattern with remarkable consistency across nearly 30 years of episodes, failing again and again to carry forward even the most obvious, most costly lessons his own actions repeatedly hand him. The show's own official description of Cartman states this directly rather than leaving it as something viewers need to work out entirely on their own. According to character information published about him, unlike other main characters such as Kyle, Stan, Kenny, and Butters, Cartman does not actually seem to learn from his mistakes, and continues doing things that backfire while blaming everyone except himself for the results. This detail, stated plainly as part of an official summary of his character, confirms that the writers built this pattern into Cartman on purpose, rather than it simply emerging by accident across years of separate, unconnected episodes written by different people at different times. This raises an interesting question about why the writers would choose to build a main character this way in the first place, especially across a show that has run for nearly 3 decades. Part of the answer likely comes down to simple comedy mechanics. A character who genuinely learns and grows becomes harder to use for the same kinds of jokes repeatedly, since real growth naturally closes off certain types of behavior a writer might otherwise want to return to for future storylines. Keeping Cartman permanently reset at his same selfish, manipulative baseline means the writers can always return to familiar territory with him, building new schemes and new conflicts around the exact same core personality that has made him popular since the show's earliest episodes. A version of Cartman who had genuinely grown past his worst traits by, say, season 15 would leave the writers with far fewer options for the kind of over-the-top, selfish scheming that has defined some of the show's most memorable episodes across every era of its run. There is also a deeper point buried inside this choice, one that connects directly back to the parenting pattern discussed in the previous section. A character who never faces real, lasting consequences at home has very little reason to ever develop the kind of self-reflection that leads to genuine change. Cartman's mother continues providing for him no matter how badly his schemes fail out in the world, which means he always has a soft place to land regardless of what happens to him elsewhere. Real growth in a person often requires facing consequences serious enough and lasting enough that avoiding them in the future becomes genuinely worth the effort of changing. Cartman's home life has never given him that kind of pressure, since nothing that happens to him outside the house appears to follow him back through the front door in any way that actually sticks. The show does occasionally flirt with the idea of Cartman changing, only to pull back from it every single time before anything permanent can actually take hold. Small moments across various episodes hint at a version of Cartman capable of something resembling real feeling. Brief flashes of insecurity or fear discussed in the earlier section covering his psychology, moments that suggest some capacity for growth might exist somewhere underneath all his usual cruelty. These moments never last beyond the episode that contains them. Whatever softness briefly appears gets fully reset by the time the next episode begins, with no reference back to the earlier moments and no indication that it changed anything meaningful about how Cartman approaches the world going forward. This pattern, teasing the possibility of change without ever actually delivering it, has repeated so many times across so many decades that it appears to function as a deliberate choice, rather than simple inconsistency in the writing. Fans and critics who have followed the show closely for years have pointed to this exact quality as part of what keeps Cartman feeling dangerous and unpredictable, even after nearly 30 years of the same basic character. A character who might change at any moment carries genuine tension, since audiences cannot fully predict what comes next. A character who teases that possibility constantly, then reliably resets every single time without exception, creates something different. It creates a strange kind of dark comfort, a sense that no matter how extreme or how dark any given episode gets, Cartman himself will always return to being exactly who he has always been. This reliability, oddly enough, may be part of why audiences have kept coming back to him for so many years. Real change change would eventually mean losing the version of Cartman most viewers actually tuned in to watch in the first place. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This total resistance to change connects directly to a much larger question the show has raised again and again over the years, one involving whether Cartman represents something bigger than simply one selfish boy, and whether his repeated turns toward controlling entire groups of people point to a much darker theme the writers keep circling back to on purpose. Section 8. Cartman keeps trying to take over the world, and the show keeps letting him try. Most of what Cartman does across South Park stays fairly small in scope. He targets one classmate, one rival, one parent, one girlfriend. A different pattern shows up again and again across the show's run, one that pushes Cartman's ambitions far beyond his own neighborhood and into something much bigger. Several times over the decades, the show has placed Cartman at the center of a plot involving entire groups of people being declared inferior, entire cities being destroyed, or entire countries being thrown into panic. All because Cartman wanted power, recognition, or simply the chance to prove he was better than everyone around him. These storylines rarely get grouped together the way other Cartman patterns do, but placed side by side, they form one of the clearest and most consistent threads running through his entire character. The earliest major example of this pattern comes from the season 9 episode Ginger Kids, which aired in 2005. The episode begins with Cartman delivering a presentation to his class, arguing that children with red hair, pale skin, and freckles, commonly called gingers, are somehow inferior to everyone else, claiming they lack souls entirely. As punishment for the presentation, Cartman is turned into a ginger himself through makeup and a costume, meant to teach him a lesson about how it feels to be on the receiving end of this kind of treatment. Rather than learning anything from the experience, Cartman does something far more disturbing. He decides that if gingers really do lack souls, that must actually make them superior rather than inferior, since a soul, in his new twisted logic, only holds a person back. He begins organizing every ginger kid at school into an actual movement built around this new belief, dressing them in matching outfits and positioning himself as their leader, planning to use their combined numbers to seize control of the school entirely. The ginger separatist movement, as it becomes known, continues showing up in later episodes and later seasons, eventually returning years afterward when Scott Tenorman revives it for his own revenge plan, discussed in an earlier section covering Cartman's father. What began as a single episode joke about a fake medical condition grew into a real, ongoing organization inside the show's world, one built entirely around the idea that one group of people deserves power over everyone else, led by a boy who invented the entire belief system on the spot purely to serve his own interests. A very different but equally telling example comes from season 5's Cartman Land, which aired in 2001. After inheriting a large sum of money from his grandmother, Cartman uses the entire fortune to buy an actual amusement park, and rather than sharing it or opening it to the public the way any normal business owner would, he bans everyone else from entering completely, keeping the park entirely for his own personal use. He renames it Cartman Land and enjoys total exclusive control over every ride and every part of the park, answering to no one and sharing with no one. On its surface, this plot works as a fairly simple, almost childish fantasy about limitless money and limitless fun. Looked at more closely, it captures something that shows up constantly throughout Cartman's storylines across the entire run of the show. Given the chance to control something entirely on his own, his first instinct is always exclusion. He does not build something to share, he builds something to keep others out of, using whatever resources land in his hands to draw a hard line between himself and everyone else, deciding who gets access and who does not based purely on his own preference. One of the darkest examples of this pattern shows up in the season 8 episode Tonsil Trouble, which aired in 2004. After getting into a fight with Kyle, Cartman learns that Kyle has recently received a blood transfusion from an HIV-positive donor, information that should have stayed private and medical. Rather than treating this as a serious health matter deserving privacy and care, Cartman sees an opportunity for revenge. He deliberately draws blood from an HIV-positive source himself and finds a way to infect Kyle directly, giving his rival a serious life-threatening illness purely to settle a personal grudge. This act goes far beyond any normal childhood conflict. It represents a willingness to cause permanent, potentially fatal harm to another person over a disagreement most people would consider minor, using a real and serious illness as a weapon against someone he has decided deserves punishment. The episode treats this with the show's usual dark humor, but the underlying act itself sits among the most severe and calculated cruelty Cartman commits across the entire series. The clearest and largest scale example of Cartman's drive toward total power and total control comes from a trilogy of episodes airing during season 14 in 2010, made up of Coon 2, Hindsight, Mysterion Rises, and Coon vs. Coon and Friends. Building on the vigilante identity discussed in an earlier section covering his hidden intelligence, Cartman becomes desperate to be recognized as the single greatest superhero among his group of friends, all of whom have taken on their own costumed identities. When his efforts to earn this recognition through normal means fail, Cartman turns to something far more extreme. He summons an ancient, monstrous being called Cthulhu, a creature of enormous size and destructive power, and forms an alliance with it, believing that controlling such a powerful ally will finally force everyone to see him as the most important hero in the group. Rather than using this alliance carefully, Cartman unleashes Cthulhu on a massive, uncontrolled path of destruction, leading the creature to attack cities and countries around the world, including causing severe damage across San Francisco and attacking targets in Japan. Innocent people across the entire planet suffer real, serious harm throughout this storyline, all because Cartman wanted personal glory and refused to accept anything less than complete recognition as the most powerful person in his friend group. The storyline eventually spirals so far out of Cartman's control that even he struggles to manage the very destruction he set into motion, showing that his hunger for total power consistently outpaces his actual ability to control what that power unleashes once it gets loose. Season 17's World War Zimmerman, which aired in 2013, offers yet another example of Cartman causing massive, nationwide chaos, this time built entirely around his own paranoid, racist beliefs. After becoming convinced that he is somehow connected to a real-world controversial figure involved in a widely covered legal case, Cartman becomes obsessed with the idea that a large-scale race war is coming to the country. Acting on this belief, he sets off a chain of events that leads to nationwide panic, including several plane crashes caused directly by the chaos he creates while trying to warn people about a threat that exists mostly inside his own head. Real people across the country experience genuine fear and confusion throughout this episode, all stemming from beliefs Cartman built for himself with no real evidence behind them. Beliefs rooted in exactly the kind of racial fear and racial superiority thinking discussed in the earlier section covering his treatment of Kyle and Jewish people. Looking at these separate storylines together across nearly 2 decades of the show reveals a pattern that goes well beyond simple childhood meanness. Cartman does not simply want to win arguments or get revenge on people who wrong him in small personal ways. Repeatedly, across many different seasons, he reaches for total control over entire groups, entire cities, or entire countries, using whatever tools happen to be available to him at the time. Whether that means organizing a group of children into a movement built on false superiority, buying exclusive control over an entire amusement park, deliberately infecting a rival with a serious illness, summoning a monster capable of leveling cities, or spreading paranoid beliefs about race that end up causing real nationwide panic. Each of these storylines stands completely separate from the others in terms of plot, yet they all circle back to the exact same underlying drive. Cartman wants power over others, and he consistently shows a willingness to cause enormous harm to entire groups of innocent people rather than just individual rivals in pursuit of that power. This pattern connects directly to the anti-Semitism discussed in the very first section of this analysis. The Ginger Separatist movement follows nearly the exact same structure as the hate group Cartman builds in The Passion of the Jew discussed earlier. In both cases, Cartman invents a belief that one group of people is inferior or dangerous, convinces others to organize around that belief, and positions himself at the head of the resulting movement, using the group's combined numbers to chase power he could never gain on his own. The specific target changes from episode to episode, sometimes Jewish people, sometimes red-headed children, sometimes an entire race of people he has decided are dangerous. But the underlying structure of the scheme repeats itself with remarkable consistency. Cartman does not appear to actually care very much about the specific belief he is promoting in any of these storylines. What he consistently cares about is the power that organizing people around a belief, any belief, allows him to gain for himself. This raises an important question about what the writers were actually trying to say by returning to this exact pattern so many times across so many different seasons. Parker and Stone have never hidden the fact that South Park uses exaggerated, extreme scenarios specifically to make points about real-world behavior, and the sheer repetition of this particular pattern across nearly 2 decades suggests it was never simply an accident or a coincidence born from writing separate, unconnected episodes. A character who repeatedly organizes people around false claims of superiority, who repeatedly repeatedly seeks total exclusive control over whatever resources land in his hands, and who repeatedly causes massive harm to entire groups of innocent people in pursuit of personal recognition, built this way again and again across multiple decades by the same two writers, appears designed specifically to explore how these patterns actually work in the real world, stripped down to their most basic, almost cartoonish core. What makes this theme land as effectively as it does is the fact that Cartman, in nearly every single one of these storylines, is a child. He holds no real political office, he commands no real army in any traditional sense. He has no legitimate source of power beyond his own manipulation skills and whatever chaos he can personally set into motion. And yet, again and again, this powerless child manages to organize entire movements, gain access to genuinely destructive forces, and cause real, serious harm on a massive scale. This detail connects directly back to the discussion in the very first section of this analysis regarding why the show chose to make its most hateful character a child in the first place. A powerless person managing to cause this much damage purely through manipulation, false belief systems, and a relentless hunger for control makes a much sharper point about how these patterns actually function than giving the same behavior to an adult with real, legitimate authority ever could. The show seems to be arguing, through Cartman's repeated schemes, that the desire for total power over others does not require real strength or real legitimate authority to become genuinely dangerous. It only requires the willingness to organize people around a lie and the confidence to keep pushing that lie even as the damage grows completely out of control. None of Cartman's attempts at total power ever end in lasting success, and this detail matters just as much as the attempts themselves. The Ginger Separatist movement eventually falls apart. Cartman Land gets shut down after tax officials become involved. Cthulhu's rampage eventually ends, though only after enormous damage has already been done. World War Zimmerman resolves once the truth behind Cartman's paranoid beliefs becomes clear to everyone around him. Every single one of these storylines follows the same basic shape discussed in earlier sections covering Cartman's failed schemes. He builds something genuinely dangerous, pushes it further than anyone reasonably should, and eventually loses control of it entirely, usually saved from the very worst possible outcome only by outside intervention or plain luck, rather than any change of heart on his own part. This consistent failure to achieve lasting power does not make the underlying pattern any less worth examining closely. If anything, watching Cartman fail every single time he reaches for total control, while still causing enormous, sometimes lasting damage along the way, mirrors something real about how these patterns tend to play out in the actual world as well. The desire for total control over others rarely succeeds completely or permanently, even when pursued with real confidence and real determination. The damage caused while chasing that control, though, often lands regardless of whether the attempt itself ultimately succeeds or collapses under its own weight. Cartman never becomes the permanent ruler of anything across the entire run of the show. The cities Cthulhu destroys stay destroyed regardless. The fear caused by his paranoid beliefs about race spreads and causes real panic, regardless of how quickly the situation eventually gets resolved. The show seems fully aware of this uncomfortable truth, returning to it again and again across nearly 2 decades, rather than treating any single instance as a one-time isolated event. Taken together, these storylines transform Cartman from a simple, if unusually cruel, schoolyard bully into something with much larger and more unsettling implications. A boy capable of organizing hate movements, seizing exclusive control over resources, deliberately spreading serious illness as revenge, unleashing city-destroying monsters, and triggering nationwide panic through paranoid racial beliefs represents something the show clearly wants examined closely, repeated often enough across enough different decades that the pattern cannot reasonably be dismissed as coincidence. Every one of these episodes stays funny on the surface, filled with the same absurd, exaggerated humor the show has always used. Underneath that humor, though, sits one of the clearest and most consistent warnings the show has ever built into any character, repeated across the exact same boy in the exact same small mountain town for nearly 30 straight years. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This same drive toward total control over Heidi Turner, examined earlier through the lens of one damaging relationship, actually connects to something even bigger once placed alongside a real political storyline the show built directly around the exact same year these patterns first started drawing serious national attention. Section 9. The Heidi storyline was built to mirror a real president. Season 21 of South Park aired aired in the fall of 2017, right in the middle of the first year of a new presidential administration that the show had already spent months satirizing through a character named Mr. Garrison, who had been elected president in the show's fictional world during season 20. Critics who reviewed the season as it aired noticed something interesting happening alongside the main political storyline. The Cartman and Heidi relationship, running as its own separate plot through the same episodes, appeared to be doing something more than simply telling a story about two school kids dating each other. Several writers pointed out at the time that the entire relationship was functioning as a direct stand-in for how millions of real people related to the new president himself, built specifically to explore why people continue supporting a leader even after watching that leader treat them badly again and again. This connection was not something critics had to search hard to find. The show placed both storylines directly next to each other throughout the season, cutting back and forth between scenes of Cartman controlling and manipulating Heidi and scenes of the fictional president dealing with his own approval ratings and his own inner circle. One review published shortly after these episodes aired described the pairing directly, stating that the show was using the country's relationship with a power-hungry, racially insensitive figure to mirror a story about one boy's relationship with one girl, calling the comparison close to perfect given how clearly the toxic behavior lined up between both storylines. Another episode from this same stretch of the season was specifically noted by critics for comparing Heidi's loyalty to Cartman with a psychological condition where hostages develop sympathy for the people holding them captive, a comparison the show built directly into the episode's plot rather than leaving it as something viewers had to infer entirely on their own. The episode Doubling Down, which aired on November 8th, 2017, makes this connection especially clear once both storylines are placed side by side. In the Cartman and Heidi plot, Cartman continues his pattern of emotional abuse discussed in an earlier section, blaming his anger on his diet and convincing Heidi to try a new eating plan with him as a show of good faith, all while continuing to insult her behind her back to his friends. In the parallel political storyline running through the same episode, President Garrison is warned by members of his own staff that public support for his administration is falling apart, and rather than addressing the actual problems causing this drop in support, he responds by locking his own advisors in a room and refusing to hear their concerns. When one of the trapped staff members is later questioned by reporters about his continued public support for Garrison, despite everything happening behind closed doors, he offers only nervous, forced praise, clearly speaking out of fear rather than genuine belief. This scene mirrors almost exactly what happens in the Cartman and Heidi storyline running through the same episode, where Heidi continues defending Cartman publicly to her friends despite everything she has experienced privately, unable or unwilling to admit that the relationship has become something she needs to escape. The parallel goes even further than simple thematic similarity. Critics reviewing the season pointed out that Heidi's specific situation, staying with someone who treats her badly because leaving would mean admitting she made a serious mistake in the first place, mapped directly onto a real psychological pattern often used to describe why people continue supporting leaders or causes long after clear evidence suggests they should reconsider. One reviewer described this pattern by name, noting that admitting a leader chosen with real hope and real belief has turned out badly requires facing a difficult truth about one's own earlier judgment, a truth that becomes easier to avoid by simply continuing to defend the original choice rather than confronting the mistake directly. Heidi's friends in the show openly mock her for ever choosing to date Cartman in the first place once she finally does attempt to break things off, a detail critics connected directly to the social pressure real people sometimes face when publicly reconsidering support for a political figure they once defended loudly and confidently to everyone around them. This comparison becomes even more pointed once Heidi's actual transformation across the season gets examined closely, a detail discussed briefly in the earlier section covering her relationship with Cartman. As the storyline progresses, Heidi does not simply tolerate Cartman's behavior from a safe distance. She begins actively absorbing his worst traits, adopting his poor eating habits, his short temper, and his overall selfish, demanding attitude toward the people around her. By the episode Moss Piglets later in the same season, the show depicts her as having become something close to a mirror image of Cartman himself, gaining significant weight from junk food, growing louder and more obnoxious, and treating people with the same casual cruelty Cartman has always shown. Critics writing about the season connected this transformation directly to a broader idea about how prolonged closeness to a toxic leader or a toxic relationship can gradually reshape a person's own behavior and beliefs, until the two people involved become difficult to tell apart from one another. Heidi becoming a smaller version of Cartman himself works as a strong visual and narrative representation of exactly this kind of gradual absorption. playing out over an entire season rather than a single episode. The comparison holds up even in how both storylines eventually resolve. President Garrison's storyline throughout the season involves growing internal conflict, with his own staff increasingly working against him or trying to manage the damage his behavior keeps causing, while his public support continues eroding despite his own repeated attempts to control the narrative around himself. Heidi's storyline follows an almost identical shape, involving growing conflict with her own friends who increasingly push back against her continued loyalty to Cartman, while her own sense of self continues eroding the longer she stays in the relationship, despite Cartman's repeated attempts to control how she understands what is actually happening between them. Both storylines eventually reach a breaking point in the same general stretch of episodes, with Garrison facing open rebellion from people around him and Heidi finally reaching the moment discussed in the earlier section covering her relationship with Cartman, where she holds him at gunpoint and finally recognizes the pattern clearly enough to walk away for good. It is worth being precise about what this comparison does and does not claim. The show never has any character directly state out loud that Heidi represents the American public or that Cartman represents any specific real political figure by name. South Park has a long history of avoiding this kind of direct, literal statement, preferring instead to build parallel storylines that run alongside each other closely enough for audiences to draw the connection themselves without ever being told exactly what to think. This approach fits the way the show has always handled political material throughout its entire run, favoring implication and parallel structure over direct, on-the-nose statements. Critics reviewing the season at the time picked up on this parallel specifically because the show placed both storylines so closely together, using nearly identical language and nearly identical emotional beats across both plots within the very same episodes, making the connection difficult to miss even without any character stating it directly. This approach also lines up with how South Park had already been handling its presidential storyline throughout the previous season. Season 20 introduced the character of Mr. Garrison as an exaggerated, over-the-top presidential candidate, whose campaign gains unexpected momentum specifically because of how loudly and confidently he says outrageous, offensive things without ever backing down or apologizing. Once elected, Garrison spends much of season 21 dealing with the reality of holding real power, discovering that the same confident, aggressive behavior that won him support in the first place creates serious problems once he actually has to govern and account for the consequences of his own decisions. Cartman's arc with Heidi mirrors this exact same shape on a much smaller, more personal scale. He wins Heidi over initially through confidence and constant praise, then struggles once the relationship requires him to actually change or take real responsibility for how his behavior affects someone else. Both characters in their own separate storylines show the same basic pattern of gaining support through bold confidence and then failing to sustain that support once real consequences and real accountability enter the picture. The timing of this storyline also matters for understanding why critics noticed the parallel so quickly. Season 21 aired during a period when a real president's approval ratings were being discussed constantly across news coverage, and public conversation at the time frequently touched on the exact question this storyline seems built to explore. Why do people continue supporting a leader even after repeated evidence suggests that support may have been a mistake? South Park has always moved quickly to respond to whatever is happening in the news at the time it is being written, often finishing an episode within a single week of a real event occurring. Building an entire season around this specific question, using both a fictional president and a fictional schoolyard relationship to explore it from two different angles at once, fits comfortably within the show's long-established habit of using its fictional Colorado town to work through whatever question is dominating real conversation at the exact moment each episode gets written. Looking back at this storyline with the benefit of time passing since it first aired, the comparison holds up as one of the more carefully built political metaphors the show has ever constructed, precisely because it never announces itself directly. A viewer who watches season 21 with no interest in politics at all can still follow the Cartman and Heidi storyline as a complete, coherent story entirely on its own terms, understanding it purely as a depiction of one specific kind of unhealthy relationship, exactly as it was analyzed earlier in this discussion. A viewer paying closer attention to how the season structures its episodes, placing political scenes and relationship scenes side by side again and again, will notice the deeper parallel running underneath the surface story, adding another full layer of meaning without changing anything about how the more direct, personal story reads on its own. This dual-layer approach connects directly back to the broader pattern discussed in the previous section, covering Cartman's repeated attempts at gaining total control over groups of people. Just as the show show used a fake medical condition to explore how quickly people can be organized around a false belief of superiority, and just as it used a summoned monster to explore what happens when someone chases total power without any real ability to control what that power actually unleashes, the Heidi storyline uses one specific, painfully detailed relationship to explore a very real and very current question about loyalty, denial, and the difficulty of admitting a serious mistake once enough personal investment has already been placed into defending it. Each of these storylines takes a real-world pattern and shrinks it down to a scale small enough to examine clearly, using Cartman as the consistent thread running through every single version of the same basic exploration, regardless of whether the scale involves an entire hate movement, a single destroyed city, or one specific personal relationship between two 10-year-old characters. The fact that South Park chose to run this particular metaphor through Cartman specifically, rather than through any other character on the show, says something important about how the writers understood their own most famous character by this point in the show's run. Nearly 20 years into the series by the time season 21 aired, Cartman had already been established repeatedly as a character who seeks control, who manipulates the people closest to him, who blames others for his own failures, and who shows almost no capacity for genuine change. Every single one of these traits discussed at length in earlier sections of this analysis. Building a political metaphor around a real president's relationship with public support required a character capable of representing exactly this combination of traits believably. Someone whose behavior audiences already understood deeply enough after years of watching him that a new layer of meaning could be placed on top of that established behavior, without requiring any real introduction or explanation. Cartman was, by this point in the show's history, simply the only character built with enough consistent history and enough specific personality traits to carry a political metaphor this precise and this sustained across a full season of episodes. This storyline also reveals something about how South Park approaches long-term planning across its episodes, a detail that connects directly back to the earlier discussion of Cartman's hidden father, revealed nearly a decade after the initial episode planted the mystery. While the Heidi and Garrison parallel unfolded across a single season rather than across nearly 10 years, it still represents the same basic writing approach, building two seemingly separate storylines that only reveal their full connection and their full meaning once viewed together as a complete picture. Both approaches require patience and careful planning from writers working on a show that produces new episodes on an extremely fast turnaround, often finishing scripts and full episodes within the same week they air. Managing to build layered, connected storytelling like this under those kinds of tight, fast-moving production conditions says something significant about how carefully Parker and Stone actually plan their storylines, even on a show frequently remembered mainly for its crude humor and its willingness to shock audiences with outrageous, over-the-top content. None of this changes how the relationship reads on its own terms, and nothing about this deeper political layer takes away from how directly and how accurately the show depicted the real patterns of an abusive relationship discussed in the earlier section covering Cartman and Heidi specifically. If anything, understanding both layers together, the personal relationship story and the political metaphor running alongside it, makes clear just how deliberately constructed this entire storyline actually was, built to work as two completely different, fully coherent stories at once, both pointing toward the exact same underlying question about why people continue defending someone who continues hurting them, whether that someone happens to be a boyfriend in a small mountain town or a leader holding real power over an entire country. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This same idea, a decade-long secret hiding in plain sight until the exact right moment arrives to reveal it, connects directly to one final mystery the show built quietly across years of episodes. One involving the paternity cover-up first planted years before Cartman was even born into the storyline that would eventually explain it. Section 10. The fake paternity story was planted nearly a decade before the truth came out. Two episodes from South Park's very first season, airing back in 1998, hold a secret that most viewers watching at the time had no real way of catching. Cartman's mom is a dirty slut, and its direct follow-up, Cartman's mom is still a dirty slut, tell a story that looks, on the surface, like a fairly simple, absurd joke about Cartman searching for his real father. Watched again after everything discussed in the earlier section covering Cartman's father, these two episodes reveal themselves as the actual starting point of one of the longest-running mysteries the show has ever built, one that would not fully pay off until 9 seasons later. The first episode opens with Cartman being teased at school for not having a father, father, prompting him to demand that his mother Leanne finally tell him the truth about who his real dad actually is. Leanne, rather than giving him a straight answer, tells Cartman a strange and confusing story, claiming that she is both his mother and his father because she is a hermaphrodite, meaning she was born with both male and female reproductive parts. This explanation is treated by the show as completely bizarre even within its own fictional world, with other characters reacting to the claim with the same confusion any reasonable person would feel hearing it for the first time. Cartman, however, accepts this explanation without much resistance, seemingly relieved just to have some kind of answer, even one this strange, rather than continuing to face teasing at school for having no answer at all. What makes this first episode so important, looking back with full knowledge of how the story eventually resolves, is a detail buried inside the background of several scenes. As the episode plays out, background dialogue and passing comments hint that the real answer to Cartman's parentage involves a professional football player from the Denver Broncos. These hints are delivered quickly and quietly enough that most viewers watching casually would have no reason to remember them, let alone connect them to anything happening years later in the show's future. A background character can be heard referencing the Broncos in connection with the mystery, and Cartman is shown at certain points standing near an unnamed man wearing a full Broncos uniform, a detail that goes completely unexplained within the episode itself. At the time this episode aired, nothing about this seemed important. It read as one more random, disconnected joke thrown into an already strange episode built around a fake medical explanation. Only years later would this brief, easy-to-miss detail reveal itself as the actual answer to the mystery hiding in plain sight the entire time. The second episode, Cartman's mom is still a dirty slut, pushes the joke even further while planting additional hints that point toward the same answer. In this episode, the entire town becomes consumed by the question of Cartman's real father, eventually turning the mystery into a full-blown media spectacle. A television announcer covering the story is heard directly asking on air whether Cartman's father might in fact be connected to the Denver Broncos, phrasing the question almost exactly the way it will eventually be confirmed to be true 9 years later. The episode plays this moment as a throwaway joke, treated with the same over-the-top, exaggerated tone the show gives most of its background news coverage gags. Watched again with the full picture in mind, the joke reads completely differently. The show was not simply inventing a random, silly rumor for a quick laugh. It was stating the actual truth outright, dressed up as an offhand joke specific enough that almost nobody watching in 1998 could have possibly taken it seriously as a real answer being seeded for the future. This episode goes even further than simply repeating the hint from the first episode. It reveals that the entire town of South Park has been actively involved in covering up the true story of Cartman's parentage, working together deliberately to protect the reputation of a specific football player at a moment when the Denver Broncos were having a particularly strong season. According to the story built into these two episodes, revealing that a star player on a winning team had secretly fathered a child outside his marriage risked becoming a distraction the team could not afford during such an important stretch of games. Rather than let the truth come out and risk that distraction, the town made a collective decision to bury the real story, choosing instead to let Leanne's hermaphrodite claim stand as the official explanation everyone would publicly accept, however strange or unconvincing that explanation actually was. This detail, that an entire town would knowingly participate in hiding a child's real parentage purely to protect a football season, sets up exactly the kind of small-town cover-up culture the show would return to 9 years later, once the full truth about Jack Tennerman finally comes out in the episodes 200 and 201. The show even includes a moment inside these early episodes where official paternity test results get directly altered as part of the cover-up, a detail that lines up precisely with what gets confirmed later in 201. Rather than simply telling Cartman a strange lie and hoping he never questions it, the town goes as far as manufacturing fake medical evidence to support the false hermaphrodite story, giving the lie a level of manufactured legitimacy that makes it far harder for anyone, including Cartman himself, to challenge or question further. This detail shows that the writers had clearly worked out the mechanics of this cover-up in real detail from the very beginning, rather than simply inventing a vague, unexplained lie with no real internal logic behind it. Understanding how completely these two early episodes set up the eventual reveal in 201 helps explain why that later revelation landed as effectively as it did with longtime fans of the show. When Scott Tenorman reveals the truth about Jack Tenorman being Cartman's biological father, discussed in detail in the earlier section covering that storyline, the moment works as a genuine twist specifically because so few viewers remembered or connected the small buried hints planted nearly a decade earlier. A twist built entirely entirely without any earlier setup can feel cheap or unearned, arriving out of nowhere with no real connection to anything the show had established previously. A twist built on hints planted years in advance, hints specific and accurate enough that they were essentially telling the truth the entire time, carries far more weight once the full picture finally comes together. Very few television shows manage to plant a secret this specific, this many years before paying it off, and even fewer manage to do it while making the hints feel like simple throwaway jokes rather than obvious foreshadowing that observant viewers might catch too early. This long-term planning becomes especially impressive once placed alongside how quickly South Park is actually produced on a week-to-week basis. Unlike shows that plan entire seasons or entire story arcs far in advance, South Park is always operated on an extremely fast production schedule, often writing, animating, and finishing a complete episode within the same week it airs, allowing the show to respond quickly to current events happening in the news. A production process built around this kind of speed does not typically leave much room for careful, long-term storytelling planned nearly a decade in advance. The fact that this particular mystery managed to survive across that kind of fast-moving production environment, staying consistent and accurate for 9 full years before finally paying off, suggests that Parker and Stone either remembered these specific details themselves across an enormous stretch of time, or deliberately returned to old scripts and old episodes while planning 201, making sure the eventual reveal would line up cleanly with jokes they had written nearly a decade earlier. The reveal itself, once it finally arrives in 200 and 201, connects every piece of this earlier setup together with real precision. Scott Tenorman, discussed extensively in the earlier section covering this storyline, discovers during his years spent researching Cartman's history that his own father, Jack Tenorman, once played right tackle for the Denver Broncos before settling in South Park. This detail lines up exactly with the background hints planted in the very first season, confirming that the Broncos connection teased all the way back in 1998 was never a random joke at all, but the actual answer hiding in plain sight the entire time. Scott also learns that the entire town conspired together to protect this secret specifically because the Broncos were having a strong season at the time, an explanation that matches, almost word for word, the reasoning given inside the original 1998 episodes for why the town chose to cover up the truth rather than let it come out naturally. This level of consistency across such a long stretch of time also reveals something important about how carefully Cartman's overall character and storylines have been built, a detail that connects directly to points raised throughout earlier sections of this discussion. A show willing to plant a real answer nearly a decade before revealing it, hidden inside jokes specific enough to be technically true while getting dismissed by nearly every viewer as pure absurdist comedy, demonstrates a level of long-term thinking that goes well beyond what casual viewers typically expect from an adult animated comedy built primarily around shock value and crude humor. The show's willingness to invest this kind of patience into a single storyline about one character's father says something significant about how much thought Parker and Stone have clearly put into Cartman specifically, treating him as a character worth building complex, long-term secrets around, rather than simply using him as a disposable source of quick jokes from one episode to the next. Fans who have gone back and rewatched the original 1998 episodes after learning the full truth in 201 have pointed out just how obvious certain details become once viewed with the full picture in mind. The Broncos uniform appearing quietly in the background, the announcer's on-air question about a Broncos connection, the specific detail about protecting a strong season from unwanted distraction. Every one of these pieces sits directly inside the earliest episodes, fully visible the entire time, waiting patiently for nearly a decade until the story finally caught up to explain exactly why they had been placed there in the first place. This kind of long-buried consistency rewards viewers willing to revisit the show's earliest seasons with fresh eyes, turning what once looked like simple, disconnected jokes into carefully placed pieces of a much larger and much darker story about family, deception, and the lengths an entire community will go to protect a secret it has decided is more important than the truth. The mystery also adds an important layer of meaning to Leanne Cartman's own character, discussed at length in the earlier section covering her failures as a parent. Rather than simply being an overly permissive mother who fails to discipline her son, these early episodes reveal that she has also been an active participant in a much larger, more calculated lie, one that required real effort and real cooperation with the rest of the town to maintain successfully for years. This detail complicates the picture of Leanne established elsewhere in the show. She is not simply passive or disengaged engaged as a parent. She is shown here to be capable of real, sustained deception when the situation calls for it, working alongside an entire community to protect a secret, specifically because the truth might have caused inconvenience for other people involved. This willingness to prioritize convenience and reputation over honesty with her own son mirrors, in a smaller and more personal way, exactly the kind of thinking that allows Cartman himself to justify so much of his own behavior across the rest of the show. The apple in this specific sense does not appear to have fallen very far from the tree. Taken together, all 10 of these areas paint a picture of a character built with far more intention, far more consistency, and far more genuine depth than his loud, crude, constantly offensive surface usually lets on. Cartman's anti-Semitism functions as a deliberate weapon aimed at real-world bigots rather than a simple, careless joke. His behavior has been studied seriously by real psychology researchers looking to understand patterns of harmful behavior in children. He orchestrated the death of his own biological father nearly a decade before either he or the audience understood the full weight of what that meant. His relationship with Heidi Turner mapped with striking accuracy onto real and well-documented patterns of abuse. His apparent stupidity conceals genuine intelligence, used almost exclusively in service of manipulation rather than honest growth. His mother's total failure to set any real boundaries created the exact environment needed for every other pattern discussed here to take root and flourish. His total inability to learn from consequences appears built into his character on purpose, chosen specifically over the alternative of letting him grow the way the show's other main characters have. His repeated attempts at gaining total control over entire groups of people echo the exact same structure again and again, regardless of which specific group ends up targeted each time. His relationship with Heidi doubled as a carefully built political metaphor, exploring loyalty and denial on a national scale, and the true story of his own father sat quietly hidden in plain sight for nearly a decade, planted with a level of patience and precision that few television shows have ever managed to pull off successfully. None of this changes what Cartman fundamentally is at his core, a deeply flawed, often cruel, frequently dangerous character built primarily to make audiences laugh through nearly 30 years of increasingly outrageous storylines. What this closer examination does reveal, though, is just how much careful thought sits underneath that laughter, built by two writers who clearly understood exactly what kind of character they were creating from the very beginning, patient enough to plant secrets nearly a decade in advance, and consistent enough to keep every single pattern discussed here holding together across almost 30 straight years of episodes, without ever once losing track of exactly who Eric Cartman really is. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.